Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into Magic Bloodline, presenting to you today. Hermione cast a diagnostic charm on Harry during first potions class and discovered 29 loyalty compulsions pointing to Dumbledore. Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1, The Diagnostic. The dungeon classroom smelled like old stone and something burnt, and Hermione Granger had already decided she didn't like Professor Snape before he'd finished taking attendance. It wasn't the voice, though the voice was unpleasant, low and precise in the way of someone who had spent years making people feel stupid for being in the same room as him. It wasn't even the way he'd looked at Harry when he called his name, like Harry was a particularly disappointing piece of homework. It was the questions. The rattling, theatrical interrogation about Bezoars and monkshood and aconite that was clearly designed not to find out what students knew but to establish, loudly and in front of everyone, what they didn't. Hermione had known the answers to all three questions. She'd had her hand up so fast her shoulder ached. He hadn't called on her once. She sat now at a long stone table with Harry to her left and Ron Weasley to her right, the latter currently holding his lacewing flies upside down over his cauldron with the specific confidence of someone who had no idea they were doing it wrong. The task was a simple, theoretically simple, boil-cure potion. First years. First class. Hermione had read the chapter twice on the train and once more before breakfast, and she'd had her ingredients sorted and her cauldron temperature correct within the first 4 minutes. Which left her mind free to wander, and her mind, when free, was never quiet. She'd been thinking about Harry since the train. Specifically, she'd been thinking about something that didn't add up, and things that didn't add up lodged in Hermione's brain like splinters, small, irritating, impossible to ignore until extracted. Harry Potter was famous. She'd known that before she'd set foot in the magical world, because she'd read about him in a beginner's guide to modern wizarding history the same week she'd read everything else she could find. The boy who lived. The child who'd survived the killing curse at age 1. Legends had been built on less. What the books hadn't mentioned, what nobody seemed to have thought worth mentioning, was that Harry Potter, in person, felt muted. That was the only word she had for it. Muted. Like a radio playing at a quarter of its proper volume. She'd noticed it when they'd shaken hands in the corridor outside the compartment, this odd sense of something vast being kept very, very small. She'd assumed at first it was nerves. He was clearly unused to his own fame, flinching slightly every time someone said his name like he expected to be told off. But that wasn't it either. Nerves were a surface thing. This was structural. She'd read about magical auras in Advanced Magical Theory, Chapter 14, and she'd read the section on diagnostic charms the way she read everything, thoroughly and with annotations. The Revello Animus charm was technically 4th-year material. She'd practiced it on her cat, Crookshanks, the week before term started, and on her mother, who hadn't noticed anything, and on herself, which had been fascinating and slightly alarming. She hadn't planned to use it on Harry. It would be terribly rude, casting diagnostic magic on a person without asking. She was quite clear on that. But she was also quite clear that something was wrong, and the splinter had been in her brain for 6 days, and the potion was simmering correctly, and her hand was already moving before she'd fully decided to let it. It was a small motion. She was good at small motions. She'd been practicing subtle wand work since August because she'd read that the best magical practitioners could cast minor charms with movements no larger than a flick of the wrist. She angled her wand under the table, kept her eyes on her cauldron, and murmured the incantation so quietly it was barely breath. Revello Animus. The diagnostic bloom opened in her peripheral vision. She'd tuned it to peripheral specifically so she could read it without obviously staring, and she saw Harry's magical signature unfurl like a map. And then she stopped stirring her potion. There were layers to a person's magical signature, the way there were layers to anything complex. The outer layer was personality, expressed in color and movement. Harry's was a deep, turbulent blue-green, with flickers of gold that moved faster than the rest, like something that wanted to run. Beneath that was core resonance, the fundamental frequency of a person's power, and Harry's core resonance was not what she'd expected. It was not modest or ordinary or proportionate to an 11-year-old. It was enormous. It was so large that she had to recalibrate her perceptual scale twice just to take it in, and even then she wasn't sure she was seeing all of it. It was like looking at a mountain through a window and not realizing, at first, that you were only seeing the foothills. That alone would have been remarkable. That alone would have had her making frantic notes in the margin of her theoretical texts for weeks. But that wasn't what stopped her stirring. Between the outer layer and the core, woven through the intermediate strata of Harry's magical architecture like threads through fabric, were compulsions. She recognized the shape of them from the chapter on coercive magic in dark arts, a historical survey. She'd read it because the banned books were often the most informative, and she'd found it in the back of Flourish and Blot's restricted section with her parents standing right there not knowing what she was picking up. Compulsions looked like knots in the diagnostic field. Small, deliberate distortions where the magical flow had been redirected. She counted 1. Then 2. Then 5. She kept counting. Her potion began to bubble slightly faster than optimal, because her attention was elsewhere and the temperature had drifted up 2 degrees, and she didn't notice, which for Hermione Granger was as good an indication as any of how profoundly she'd been derailed. 29. 29 compulsions, woven so deeply into Harry's magical architecture that several of them had clearly been there since before he had any magic to anchor them to. The oldest ones, she could tell age from the way the field had grown around them, like a tree growing around a nail, were infant work. Someone had done this to a baby. And they all pointed the same direction. All 29. She couldn't see names in a diagnostic charm, couldn't read intentions or histories. But she could see the angle of the tethers, and all 29 of them pointed toward a single external source, somewhere above them and to the north, with the specific vector of, "You've stopped stirring." Harry's voice. She startled so hard she nearly knocked her cauldron. "Your potion," he said, nodding at it. He was already reaching across with his own stirring rod to give it a corrective clockwise rotation. It was going to boil. She stared at him. He looked back with those green eyes, too bright, she'd always thought, even from the train, too sharp for someone who was supposed to be ordinary, and waited for her to say something. She said nothing. She looked back at her cauldron, corrected the temperature, and resumed stirring with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose body was continuing its assigned task while her mind was somewhere else entirely. 29. She thought about Dumbledore's welcoming speech. The warmth of it, the deliberate grandfatherly theater. She thought about the way every adult in the magical world seemed to watch Harry with a specific kind of expectant attention, like they were waiting for him to fulfill a function. She thought about the prophecy she'd read about, offhandedly mentioned in 2 of her books, always described in passive language, it is said, it is believed, as though the people writing the books weren't quite comfortable with how certain they were. She thought about 29 knots, and a baby, and a single directional tether pointing north toward the headmaster's tower. She made herself wait until class was over. That was the hardest part, sitting through the remaining 40 minutes of Snape's demonstration and his pointed commentary on Ron's lacewing fly disaster and his absolute refusal to acknowledge that Hermione's potion was the only one in the room that had come out the correct shade, and saying nothing, doing nothing, keeping her face neutral and her hands occupied with the correct motions. When the bell, a low, resonant dungeon gong, sounded, she began packing her bag with methodical speed. "Harry," she said quietly. "I need to show you something." "Not here." He looked at her. He had, she'd noticed, a very specific way of looking at people when he was paying full attention, slightly tilted, a small crease between his brows, and she was getting that look now. "Something wrong?" he said. "Possibly." She zipped her bag. "Probably. Can you come to the library tonight after dinner? And, this is important, don't tell anyone. Not even Ron." He glanced at Ron, who was scraping solidified potion off his cauldron with the focused misery of someone who'd expected better from themselves. Something shifted in Harry's expression, not quite suspicion, not quite worry. More like the look of someone who'd spent years sensing that something was off and had just heard a sound that might be an explanation. "What time?" he said. 7, she said. "The back section. Near the charms reference alcove. You know it?" "I'll find it." She believed him. The library was quiet at 7 in the way that only large spaces with very strict rules could be quiet, a dense, pressurized silence full of rustling parchment and the distant creak of shelves. Madame Pants was at her desk near the entrance and would stay there. Hermione had noted, over 3 days of library observation, that the librarian almost never came to the back reference section during evening hours because there was a less comfortable chair back there and she had bad knees. Harry was already at the table when Hermione arrived. He'd gotten there early, which surprised her slightly. She'd pegged him as someone who was perpetually slightly late, pulled along by circumstances, but he was sitting with his hands flat on the table and his eyes open, and he had the look of someone who'd spent the afternoon deciding to trust something. She set her bag down and pulled out 4 books and a sheaf of parchment before she said anything. "I did something in potions," she started. "Something you didn't ask me to do, and I want to apologize for that first, because it wasn't my place and I should have, Hermione." She stopped. "Just tell me," he said. "Whatever it is." She told him. She was a good explainer, she'd always been a good explainer. It was the thing she'd been told was annoying about her, but she'd decided at some point that being clear was more important than being likable, and she laid it out in order, without dramatizing it. The diagnostic charm. What a magical signature looked like and how to read one. What a compulsion looked like in a diagnostic field. And then the count. Harry listened without interrupting. His hands, which had been flat on the table, slowly curled into fists as she spoke, not with anger exactly, or not only with anger, but with the progressive tension of someone receiving information that is confirming something they have always half known and never had language for. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 29, he said. Yes. And they all point toward Dumbledore. Yes. Another silence. The shelves creaked somewhere in the middle distance. What do they do? He said. His voice was very even. She found it slightly alarming how even his voice was, and then she thought, that's probably one of the compulsions, and felt a cold, nauseated anger on his behalf that she had to carefully set aside. I couldn't read the specific functions from the diagnostic, she said. That would require a deeper scan, a revello profundus, which is 6th-year magic and requires physical contact. But I can make educated inferences based on their position in your magical architecture. She spread her annotated copy of Advanced Magical Theory open to the relevant chapter. Compulsions placed in the outer personality layer affect behavior, they shape emotional responses, default reactions, inclinations. Compulsions in the intermediate strata affect cognition, perception, memory formation, the connections you make between ideas. You have, she consulted her notes, 11 in the outer layer, 14 in the intermediate strata, and 4 that are anchored directly to your core, which is, she paused, actually quite frightening, because core-anchored compulsions are the most permanent, and removing them is the riskiest. What do you mean, riskiest? Core-anchored compulsions become load-bearing, she said. If they've been there long enough, your magical development has grown around them, incorporated them. Removing them incorrectly can cause, the books describe it as, magical fracture. I'm not certain exactly what that means, but the descriptions are very unpleasant. He looked at her steadily. But it can be done. I think so. With the right ritual, the right preparation, and ideally a calm environment. She hesitated. And I think it should be done. All of them. I think, she stopped herself, because the next thing she wanted to say was a large thing and she hadn't decided yet whether it was her place to say it. Say it, he said. He had, she was noticing, an unsettling talent for reading her pauses. I think they've been suppressing you, she said. Your magical output should be, Harry, your core is very large. Larger than anyone I've read about in recorded history, and I've read about quite a lot of people in quite a lot of recorded history. But your active magical expression is ordinary. Not below average, not alarming, just normal. And the compulsions are sitting between your core and your output like a series of filters. Dampening it. All of it. He looked at the table. That explains some things, he said quietly. What things? He lifted his eyes to hers and there was something in them that was older than 11, a specific kind of tired, not the tired of someone who hadn't slept enough, but of someone who'd spent years pushing against something without knowing what it was. I used to do things, he said. When I was younger. Things I couldn't explain and couldn't control. I'd think, I'd want something, really badly, and it would just happen. Fly off the shelf, or, he made a small gesture, dismissive, but she caught the echo of something vivid in it. And then it stopped. When I was about 4 or 5, I think. I just sort of assumed I'd gotten better at behaving. Hermione thought about a 4-year-old and a set of compulsions being added in layers over time, and she pressed her lips together hard to keep the expression off her face. You hadn't gotten better at behaving, she said. Someone had gotten better at controlling you. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with a decisiveness that felt like a decision being made, not a snap decision, but the final click of something that had been building for weeks. Right, he said. So. How do we fix it? She'd prepared for this. She'd spent the afternoon in the library with a stack of books she'd had to request from the restricted section by forging a permission slip. She was not proud of this, but she was also not excessively guilty about it, given the circumstances, and she'd found 3 partial ritual frameworks for compulsion removal and 1 complete one in a text called On the Dissolution of Coercive Enchantments, written in 1843 by a healer named Aldous Pemberry who had apparently spent 30 years studying magical abuse. The Pemberry method, she said, pushing the book toward him. It's a sequential removal ritual. We work from the outside in, personality layer first, then intermediate strata, then core. We do them in clusters rather than individually to minimize magical trauma, but we can't do too many at once or the shock is too significant. How long does it take? Total? 3 sessions, at minimum. Probably 4 to be safe. Spread over, I'd suggest a week between each one. That's a month. That's a month, she confirmed. And in that time, you'll need to be careful. The compulsions that remain will be destabilized by the partial removal. They might behave erratically. Your emotions might. I'm 11, he said, with the first hint of dry humor she'd heard from him. My emotions are already erratic. She found herself smiling slightly despite herself. More so than baseline 11-year-old erratic. Fair warning. He looked at the Pemberry book, properly looked at it, scanning the open page with the quick, comprehensive attention of someone who read faster than they appeared to. She noticed that too. The speed of it. The quiet efficiency. There's one more thing, she said. He looked up. We can't tell anyone we're doing this. Not teachers, not friends, not Dumbledore, he said. Definitely not Dumbledore. She met his eyes. Harry, whoever did this has access to you. We don't know if there are other mechanisms, other monitoring charms, other methods of observation. We have to assume that anything we do that is visible or communicated will find its way back to the source. Which means we do this quietly, quickly, and without advertising it. He looked at her for a long, still moment. You could have reported this, he said. Gone to a teacher, or I don't know. Whoever you'd go to. Why are you helping me instead? It was a fair question. It deserved a real answer, and she took a moment to find one. Because I think the proper channels are the problem, she said. I think if I went to a teacher with this, that teacher would go to the headmaster. And the headmaster is where all those tethers point. She paused. And because I found it, she added. It doesn't feel like something I can find and then just walk away from. That would be doing the same thing everyone else is doing. Just, Knowing something is wrong and choosing not to act on it because acting on it is complicated. He held her gaze for another moment, and she had the distinct sense of being evaluated, carefully, without judgment, but precisely. Then something in his expression relaxed, just slightly, in the way of someone who has decided, finally, to stop bracing. "When do we start?" he said. "Not tonight. Tonight we read." She pushed 3 of the other books toward him. "I need you to go through chapters 7, 12, and 15 in these. I've marked the relevant sections. The ritual requires both participants to understand the theoretical framework, not just the practitioner." He looked at the stack. "You want me to read 3 books tonight? Marked sections. It's probably about 90 pages total." He picked up the top book. "Read the spine. Read the first marked section header." Something small and sharp moved across his face, the look, she was already learning, of Harry encountering something genuinely interesting, and he settled back in his chair and started reading. She opened on the dissolution of coercive enchantments to the beginning of the Pembury Method section and did the same. For an hour they read in silence, and it was surprisingly comfortable, the particular companionable quiet of 2 people who are both thinking hard about the same problem from different angles. She made notes. He made notes, which surprised her. His handwriting was cramped and pragmatic, and the notes were good, precise, relevant observations, not just transcription but actual thinking. She found herself glancing at them when he pushed a page toward her with a question he'd marked, and finding that his questions were often the right questions. At 8:30, Ron came looking for Harry with the air of someone who'd been half watching the clock for an hour and finally cracked. "There you are," he said, arriving at the table with the specific energy of someone interrupting something they've half decided not to interrupt. His eyes went to the books, then to Hermione, then back to Harry with an expression that was part confusion and part something else she couldn't quite read. "What are you? What's all this?" "Study group," Harry said, without looking up. His voice was easy, unremarkable. He was good at that, she noted. Good at sounding ordinary in moments when he wasn't. Was that a compulsion, or just him? She didn't know yet. "For potions. Extra reading," Hermione said. "I suggested it. We're reviewing theoretical frameworks for, right, yes, no." Ron picked up the least alarming of the 4 books, squinted at the title, A Theoretical Approach to Enchantment Dissolution, and set it back down with the expression of someone who'd touched a hot stove and was trying to pretend they hadn't. "Brilliant. Very normal. I'm going to go back and play chess." "We'll be done soon," Harry said. Ron departed. Harry waited until the footsteps were clearly retreating, then looked up from his book. "He'll ask questions," he said. "I know." She turned a page. "I like Ron. But Ron talks." "Yeah," Harry said. Not defensive, not disloyal, just acknowledging the truth of it in the same tone he'd used to acknowledge the weather. "Yeah, he does." They packed up at 9, tucking the books into their bags with the specific care of people transporting something fragile. "Hermione," Harry said, as they were shouldering their bags. "Yes." He seemed to be looking for something, the right configuration of words for a thing he didn't usually say. "I knew something was off," he said. "With me. I didn't have words for it. Just, this feeling, like." He made the small gesture again, the one she was starting to recognize as his shorthand for things he found difficult to articulate. "Like I was always half asleep. Like there was a version of me that was more awake, somewhere, that I couldn't get to." She looked at him steadily. "We'll get you there," she said. "I promise." He nodded. She was not a person who made promises lightly, and she suspected he knew that already. He'd been watching her too, she realized. They'd been reading each other this whole time. Walking back through the castle, they split at the 3rd floor. She headed up toward Gryffindor Tower while he climbed alongside her, both of them quiet, both of them thinking. The castle was half-lit and full of shadows, and somewhere above them a suit of armor was creaking in a phantom draft. "Can I ask you something?" he said, as they reached the portrait hole. "Of course. The diagnostic charm. You said it's fourth-year material." "Yes." "How'd you know it?" She looked at him, and he was looking at her with that small, precise attention, the slight crease between his brows. Not suspicious, curious. Genuinely curious. "I read ahead," she said. "How far ahead?" She considered telling him the polite version. "The entire Hogwarts standard curriculum is covered in the books available at Flourish and Blots," she said instead. "Through 7th year. I read them all over the summer." He stared at her. "I had a lot of time," she said, aware she sounded slightly defensive. "And it was all very interesting." He kept looking at her for a moment longer. Then the corner of his mouth pulled up, not a full smile, not yet, but the genuine article, unperformed, and he said, "Okay. Brilliant. Good. That's probably going to be useful." "It's definitely going to be useful," she said. The portrait hole swung open and they climbed through, and the common room was warm and loud and full of the comfortable chaos of 30 children who'd survived their first day without disaster, and Hermione went to her dormitory and Harry went to his, and neither of them slept particularly well. In her room, lying in the dark with Crookshanks a warm weight at her feet and the castle settling around her, Hermione stared at the ceiling and thought about 29 knots in the fabric of a person, and about a baby in a house somewhere, and about Albus Dumbledore, who everyone said was the greatest wizard alive and who had something like 115 years of practice at being trusted. She thought about the angle of those tethers, pointing north, pointing upward, pointing toward the 7th floor. She thought about what it meant that someone so powerful, so trusted, so universally beloved, had spent 11 years weaving chains around a child and calling it protection. Then she opened her eyes, sat up, turned her bedside lamp on, and began drafting their removal protocol in a fresh notebook. She was, as she'd always been, at her best when she had a problem to solve. And this was a very large problem. And she intended to solve it completely. Somewhere across the castle, in the headmaster's tower, a small instrument that monitored the magical signatures of certain important individuals twitched on its shelf and made a sound like a single discordant note, and then was still. Dumbledore, seated by his window with a glass of warm mead and a very long view of the future, turned his head to look at it. His expression did not change. He had long ago perfected the art of receiving unpleasant information without reacting to it outwardly. He set his mead down, slowly, and looked at the instrument for a long moment. Then he looked out the window at the dark grounds, and at the black water of the lake, and at the stars. He said. Nothing more than that. But his eyes were not the kind of eyes that said and meant nothing by it. Chapter 2, the first removal. The week before the ritual, Harry started paying attention differently. It was Hermione's suggestion, or rather, her instruction, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had decided that suggestions were insufficient to the situation. "I need you to keep a log," she'd said, pressing a small, unlined notebook into his hands the morning after their library session. "Everything that feels automatic. Every time you feel an impulse you didn't choose. Every time you catch yourself being less than you actually are." He'd taken the notebook without argument and spent 3 days filling it in pencil, small and cramped, during lessons and meals and the long dead hours before dawn when sleep wouldn't come. By Thursday it was half full. "Snape says something cutting about Dad. I want to say something back. Something specific, something sharp, I can feel it right there, and then it's just gone. Like a door closing. Dumbledore smiled at me in the corridor and I felt, I don't know how to describe it. Warm. Safe. Like everything was fine. It wasn't a feeling that came from anything real. It appeared. Ron wanted to skip Charm's review and I went along with it even though I didn't want to. I don't know why I went along with it. Someone from Slytherin called me a freak. I thought about saying something. Then I thought, he's just upset, I probably shouldn't, and the thought felt wrong. Like a recording of a thought, not an actual one. The last entry was the one that disturbed him most. He'd read it over twice and then written underneath it, I wonder how many of my thoughts are mine. Then he'd closed the notebook and stared at the dormitory ceiling until Neville's alarm went off. He didn't tell Ron about the notebook. He didn't tell Ron much of anything that week, which was strange because Ron was his first real friend and the ease of their friendship had felt miraculous, uncomplicated in a way that nothing else in his life had been uncomplicated. But Hermione's warning kept returning, Ron talks. Not maliciously. Not deliberately. Ron talked the way rivers ran downhill, naturally, inevitably, without any particular intention to flood anything. What Harry couldn't afford, right now, was a flood. So he laughed at Ron's jokes and played chess badly on purpose because losing was easier than explaining why he was suddenly winning, and he ate dinner and went to classes and handed in his homework, and the whole time there was a second current running under all of it, private and cold and absolutely focused. Hermione, for her part, was doing 6 things simultaneously. This appeared to be her natural state. She'd sourced the materials for the Pembury ritual through a combination of the Hogwarts supply cupboard, for the things that had legitimate classroom applications, and 2 owl orders to separate apothecaries in Diagon Alley, paying from her own savings and writing the orders in the formal, slightly clipped language of a parent buying educational supplies. She'd booked a private practice room under the pretense of extra charms work. She'd built a modified diagnostic framework in her notebook that would let her track each compulsion cluster in real time during the removal, so she could stop immediately if anything began to fracture. She'd also, in the margins of this framework, drawn a small map of Harry's magical architecture from memory, the outer layer in blue, the intermediate strata in green, the core in gold, with each of the 29 compulsions marked as a small red X. Looking at it gave her the same cold, specific anger she'd felt in the potions classroom. It looked like a cage drawn from the inside. Thursday evening she found him in the common room and put the notebook open to the map in front of him without saying anything. He looked at it for a long time. She watched his face. The ones at the core, he said finally, touching one of the gold layer X's without quite making contact. Those are the oldest? Yes. The bottom 3 are, I estimate pre-verbal. Before you were walking. He nodded slowly. Something moved through his face that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, the specific expression of someone integrating a very large and ugly fact. She'd seen it in the mirror once, when she was 9, the morning after she'd overheard 2 girls at school talking about her and discovered that cruelty from people you hadn't expected it from was a different category of thing entirely. He was doing what she'd done that morning, not denying it, not falling apart, just making room for it. Deciding it was something he could carry. Okay, he said. Saturday. Saturday, she confirmed. Saturday arrived with the particular grey indifference of Scottish autumn, a flat, overcast morning that smelled of old rain and cold stone and the distant edge of something that might become fog by evening. Breakfast was loud and ordinary. Harry ate toast and didn't taste it. Ron was explaining a chess strategy to Dean Thomas with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign, and Harry laughed in the right places and thought about the notebook in his bag. At 9 he made an excuse about the library and left. At 9:15, Hermione was already in practice room 4 on the 2nd floor, which was about the size of a large bathroom and smelled of chalk and old wood, and which had, crucially, no portraits on the walls and no windows, just stone and the low, even hum of a space that had been shielded at some point in its history and retained the residue of that shielding. She'd arranged the space while he was at breakfast. Candles, 12 of them, in a specific geometric pattern she'd taken from the Pembury text. A clear space in the center of the floor, stripped of the practice mats that normally lived there. 2 chairs facing each other, close enough that their knees would nearly touch when they sat. Her modified diagnostic framework open on a small table to the left. Harry came in, shut the door, looked at the room, and said, "You've been here since dawn, haven't you?" 6:30, she said. Right. He took his bag off his shoulder and set it by the door. He was in his regular clothes, jeans and a t-shirt that was too large for him, clearly a hand-me-down, and she felt the cold anger again briefly before putting it away. He looked at the candles and the chairs. "Walk me through it." She did. The Pembury ritual worked on sympathetic resonance, two magical practitioners creating a shared field, within which the removal practitioner could access the subject's magical architecture with enough precision to dissolve individual compulsion knots without tearing the surrounding structure. The critical element was the synchronization. If their fields fell out of alignment during a removal, the process would abort. If they fell out of alignment during the removal of a core-anchored compulsion, the abort would be violent. "How violent?" he said. The text describes one case study where the subject was incapacitated for 2 weeks and temporarily lost access to their magic entirely. "Right." He rolled his shoulders once, like he was settling into something physical. "And the outer layer ones shouldn't be that bad?" "The outer layer ones should be uncomfortable rather than dangerous." The Pembury text describes it as, she checked her notes, a sharp unpicking sensation, followed by a period of emotional intensity as the suppressed responses resurface. Which is a clinical way of saying it might feel quite bad emotionally. "Great. I'll be right here," she said. And then felt slightly strange about having said it, because it was a personal thing to say and she wasn't usually personal, but he just nodded with an expression of uncomplicated gratitude that made it feel not strange after all. They sat in the chairs, facing each other, close enough that she could see the thin white scar on his forehead clearly, the lightning bolt, precise and deliberate, nothing like the random mark left by an ordinary injury. She'd been thinking about that scar too. It showed up in the diagnostic field as its own structural anomaly, separate from the compulsions, and she hadn't yet figured out what it was. Not tonight. Tonight was the first cluster, the 5 outer layer compulsions she'd identified as behavioral suppressors, the ones that were making him quiet when he should be loud, agreeable when he should be pushing back, small when he was, in fact, enormous. "Hands," she said. He held his hands out, palms up. She placed hers in them, not gripping, just resting, the contact light enough that either of them could break it easily. This was important. Pembury had been very clear about consent geometry. The subject had to be able to withdraw at any moment, and the architecture of the ritual had to reflect that. A removal conducted without ongoing consent is simply another compulsion, he'd written, and she'd underlined it twice. "Close your eyes," she said. He closed them. "I'm going to cast the synchronization charm first. You'll feel a, sort of a pull, or a pressure. That's normal. Just breathe." She picked up her wand with her right hand, her left remaining in contact with his right palm, and began. The synchronization charm was a slow thing, built in increments like a musical chord. She laid down the first harmonic, felt her own magical field respond, then reached outward with it carefully. His field pushed back, not aggressively, more the instinctive resistance of something that had learned to keep its boundaries up, and she let it, didn't push, just held the offered resonance steady until his field recognized it as non-threatening and settled. It took about 4 minutes. When the sync locked, she felt it like a small click behind her sternum, and Harry's breath shifted, in through the nose, out slow, the particular release of someone who has been slightly braced and has decided to stop being braced. "Okay," he said, quietly. "Okay," she confirmed. She opened the diagnostic view. In the shared field she could see his architecture much more clearly than she'd been able to from across a potions classroom. The layers were distinct and detailed, and the compulsion knots were almost luminous in their wrongness, bright hard points of deliberate structure in the organic flow of everything around them. She identified the first cluster, 5 outer layer compulsions, 3 of which appeared to be behavioral dampeners and 2 of which looked like emotional response filters. She started with the smallest. The dissolution technique was, in some ways, like unpicking embroidery, finding the thread that tied the knot, following it to its anchor point, and then carefully, with precisely calibrated magical pressure, loosening it without disturbing anything around it. The Pembury text had described it as requiring what it called surgical intent, not brute force, not general casting, but focused, specific, deliberate magical action aimed at a single target. Her first attempt took 11 minutes. She was aware of time passing in a specific, extended way, each second distinct and present, her attention so narrow that the rest of the room ceased to register. She felt the knot resist, felt the structure around it flex and creak, felt Harry's field pulse once with something that might have been pain. His hands tensed in hers briefly and then deliberately relaxed. The knot came apart. It didn't dissolve gently. It released, a word she'd use in her notes afterward, like a held breath or a spring under tension, a sudden bright unraveling that sent a ripple through the shared field that she felt in her teeth and her chest and somewhere behind her eyes. She held the synchronization steady through it, kept her hands steady, kept the resonance clean. Harry made a sound. Not a scream or a gasp, more the involuntary exhale of someone who's been hit in a way they weren't entirely prepared for. His hands gripped hers, tight, and then loosened. The silence afterward was different from the silence before. Something in the quality of the room had shifted, less pressure, slightly. "Harry," she said. "Still with me?" "Yeah," he said. His voice was rougher than before. "Yeah, what was that one?" "I don't know exactly what it was for. But based on its position it was suppressing, I think it was suppressing anger." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm angry." "Yes," she said. "That's probably the suppressed responses resurfacing. The Pembury text says, I know what the Pembury text says." Not sharp, not rude, just very direct, more direct than she'd heard from him yet. "I know. I'm just, noting it. I'm angry." Another pause. "Not at you. I know. At everything." He opened his eyes then. His face was slightly flushed and his jaw was tight and there was something in his expression that had been absent before, a live wire quality, an aliveness in the eyes that was different from what she'd seen across the library table. More present. More there. How many were in this cluster? "For more," she said. "Do you want to continue?" His jaw tightened further. Then released. "Yes. Do them." She did them. The second compulsion took 9 minutes. The third took 14, because it was tangled with a memory fragment that she had to work around with extreme care, and Harry's breathing went ragged twice during it and she had to pause both times to let the synchronization restabilize. The fourth came apart almost immediately, as though it had been waiting, and the ripple from it was so strong that one of the 12 candles blew out and neither of them mentioned it. The fifth was different. She'd thought it was another behavioral dampener, but when she got close to it she could see it was something else, layered differently, anchored at 2 points instead of 1, with a specific architecture that she recognized from her reading as an emotional redirection rather than a suppression. Not blocking a feeling but routing it elsewhere. She held very still in the diagnostic field and tried to map where it was routing to, and when she found the answer she had to close her eyes and breathe before she continued. It was routing what she was fairly certain was Harry's grief, the deep, structural kind, the grief of someone who had lost something before they had language for what they'd lost, away from consciousness and down toward the core, where it had been compressing for 11 years like sediment on the bottom of the sea, getting denser and darker and more pressurized with every year. She took the knot apart very slowly. More slowly than any of the others. The release, when it came, was not a spring or a breath. It was a wave. Harry's hands tightened on hers again, hard enough that she felt the bones protest slightly, and she heard him make a sound that wasn't words, low and sharp and entirely involuntary, and then he was very still, and when she looked up his face was wet. He wasn't crying the way a person cries when they choose to cry. He was crying the way a person cries when 11 years of redirected grief finds its way home all at once with no warning and no preparation and no way to stop it. The tears were running down his face and he was looking straight ahead with an expression of profound shock, like someone who'd been hit by a wave they hadn't seen coming, and his hands were still holding hers with that bone-aching tightness. Hermione held on. She didn't say anything. She didn't look away, didn't make the situation about her own discomfort, just held on and kept the synchronization field stable and steady and present, because that was what he needed and she knew it. After a while the tears slowed and stopped. He didn't wipe his face immediately, just let it be, which she found oddly brave, that not hiding of it. "Sorry," he said finally. "Don't be," she said. Firmly. "Don't apologize for that. That wasn't weakness, that was 11 years of something being let go. There is nothing to apologize for." He looked at her. His eyes were reddened and very green, and he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like someone who was exactly where they were, not half present, not managed, not filtered. Just there. "How many did we do?" he said. 5. "That's the cluster." "The first cluster, yes." He let out a long breath. Released her hands, which she hadn't realized how much she'd needed until the pressure eased. He scrubbed his face with his palms, sat forward with his elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor for a moment. "I feel different," he said. "I would imagine." "No, I mean," he searched for words. "It's like when you're in a loud room for a very long time and you stop noticing the noise, and then it goes quiet." He looked up. "That's what this is. The noise is just gone." She looked at him and thought about noise and about babies and about a very old man with 115 years of patience and planning, and she kept the anger in its box where it belonged because this moment wasn't for anger. "Get some rest today," she said. "Drink a lot of water. Eat something substantial. Magical exertion depletes blood sugar faster than people expect. And write in the notebook tonight if you can. Whatever feels different. Whatever comes up. Even if it's, especially if it's, the grief stuff." "Yes." He nodded. He picked up his bag and slung it over his shoulder, and when he stood he seemed, not taller, exactly, but more fully occupying his height. Like something that had been slightly folded had unfolded. At the door he paused. Turned back. "Hermione," he said. "Yes." He seemed to be choosing his words again, that same careful process she'd noticed in the library. "When I figure out what I actually am," he said. "What I'm actually like, without all the, whatever's in there. I want you to know it was already obvious that you're the most capable person I've met in my life. In case that changes at all, in case I become someone different. I want that to have been said before." She blinked. She was not accustomed to being seen clearly by people she'd just met, and the precise accuracy of the compliment, capable, not smart, not clever, but capable, was somehow more striking than a general one would have been. "It won't change," she said. "Good," he said. And left. She sat alone in the candlelit room for a few minutes after he'd gone, reviewing her notes, and thought about the map of his magical architecture and the 24 remaining red X's. 24. They'd removed 5. Small beginning, but a beginning. She thought about the instrument on the shelf in the headmaster's tower, the one that had twitched the night she'd cast the diagnostic. She wondered if it had twitched again just now. She blew out the 11 remaining candles one by one, and went to find breakfast. The change in Harry was not visible from across a room. She'd been afraid it might be, afraid that the compulsion removal would trigger some visible, dramatic transformation that Dumbledore or another sharp-eyed adult would notice immediately. But people, she was learning, were mostly watching for what they expected to see. They expected Harry Potter to be quiet and modest and slightly overwhelmed, and that expectation meant they weren't looking carefully enough to notice that the quiet was now chosen, the modesty now examined, the overwhelm replaced by something much more considered. Ron didn't notice. He was happy because Harry agreed to another chess game Saturday evening and lost convincingly, which was by that point deliberate. Harry had noted in the small spaces of the afternoon that he was, in fact, quite good at chess. He'd just never beaten Ron at it because something in him had always found a reason not to. Snape noticed something. It was in Monday's potions class. Snape was making his usual circuit of the room, deploying his particular talent for standing slightly behind students at the precise moment of their greatest uncertainty, when he stopped at Harry's station and looked at the cauldron for a long moment without saying anything. Harry was stirring at the correct interval and temperature, which Snape had not previously had occasion to observe. His gaze went from the cauldron to Harry, measuring, and there was a specific quality to the look, not hostility, not surprise exactly, but the subtle recalibration of someone whose model of a person has just been disrupted. He moved on without comment. But he looked back twice. Hermione filed that away. Tuesday brought Defense Against the Dark Arts, and Quirrell's peculiar stuttering lecture on vampires, and Harry sitting beside her making notes in the margin of his parchment that she kept catching glimpses of, not class notes but observations, quick and sharp, about the defensive gaps in the techniques Quirrell was describing. She glanced at them once and saw, he's never actually taught this to someone who'll need to use it. Then below it, why does the turban smell like garlic? That's not how vampires work. She covered her smile with her hand. Wednesday evening she was in the library when she felt a shadow over her table and looked up to find that Snape had somehow materialized next to her bookshelf with the specific silence of a very large cat. She did not jump. She was proud of this. "Miss Granger," he said. "Professor Snape." He looked at the books on her table. His gaze moved across the spines with the quick precision of someone who read titles faster than most people read sentences, and his expression did not change, but there was a specific stillness to the not changing that she'd begun to recognize as the expression Snape wore when he was considerably more interested than he intended to appear. Advanced Magical Theory. Dark Arts, a Historical Survey. A Compendium of Coercive Enchantments, Historical and Contemporary. An interesting selection, he said, for a first year. "I'm an advanced reader," she said. "Evidently." He looked at her. "What, precisely, are you researching?" She held his gaze. "Theoretical framework for a charms essay," she said. The pause that followed was precisely long enough to make clear that he did not believe this and that they both knew he didn't believe this, without being long enough to constitute an accusation. "The restricted section materials you borrowed on Friday," he said. The request form was signed by Professor Flitwick. "Yes," she said. "Professor Flitwick tells me he signed no such form." She kept her expression neutral, which required some effort. "There must be some confusion," she said. Snape's eyes were extraordinarily dark and very still, and they were doing something she could only describe as reading her, not her expression, but something underneath it. He stood there for a moment longer, and she sat there, and the library hummed around them with parchment and dust. "Miss Granger," he said finally, very quietly. "If someone with exceptional intelligence were conducting an independent research project of, let us say, significant sensitivity. And if that project were to reach a stage where the resources available to an 11-year-old were no longer sufficient." He paused. "They would be well advised to be very careful about who they approached for assistance." She said nothing. "And equally well advised," he continued, "that there are members of the faculty who have their own reasons to take an interest in certain topics." Another pause. "Purely academically speaking." He left. He didn't wait for her response. He simply turned and moved away through the shelves with that uncanny silence, and was gone. Hermione sat very still for a moment. Then she opened her notebook and wrote, "Snape knows something. Or suspects. Unclear whose side. Do not confirm anything. But do not close the door." She underlined "do not close the door" twice. Thursday evening she and Harry met in the practice room again, not for a removal, but to plan, to review her notes and cross-reference against the Pembury text and against Harry's notebook entries, which he pushed across the table with the slightly braced expression of someone offering something private. She read them carefully. The entry that stopped her was from Tuesday night. "I had a dream about my mum. I don't know what she looked like. I don't have any pictures. The Dursleys didn't." The pencil had paused here, she could tell, and there was a slightly heavier mark where the lead had been pressed before the next word, "anyway. I don't have pictures. In the dream I just knew it was her. She was standing in a garden and she was laughing at something, and I knew I was the thing she was laughing at. Not in a mean way. She thought I was funny. I was making her laugh. I woke up and I felt, long pause, long heavy mark, multiple corrections, I felt like I'd lost her again. But different from how I thought I'd lost her. I always thought I lost her when I was one and it was over. This is like losing her now. Like there was a person I was supposed to know and didn't get to. I think the compulsions were probably blocking this too. The grief about her specifically. About both of them. That's the thing I can't quite hold on to without it sliding away. Someone did this to me so that I wouldn't properly grieve my own parents. What kind of plan requires a child not to grieve? Hermione set the notebook down and looked at the table for a moment without speaking. Harry was watching her. "You can say it," he said. "I don't know what to say," she said, which was unusual enough for her that they both noted it. "I'm very angry on your behalf." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." "Whatever plan this is part of," she said carefully. "Whatever Dumbledore needed you to be that required 29 compulsions to manufacture, it requires you to be a specific thing. Kept a specific shape. And I think," she paused. "I think when we've removed all of them, we need to find out what that thing is. What you were being shaped for. Because I don't think this is just about control." "I think you're right," he said. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, in that posture she'd come to associate with Harry thinking hard about something. "I've been reading about the prophecy." She looked up. "There's a prophecy," he said. "About me and Voldemort." He said the name flatly, without the flinch that everyone else seemed to have around it, and that too felt like something that had come free with the first removal. "Most people know there is one. The actual content seems to be, very carefully controlled. Almost like the text itself is restricted." "I know," she said. "I found a reference in wizarding records of the 20th century but it was redacted. Which is, unusual. Prophecies are usually public record." "Restricted record, you think?" "Restricted specifically," she said. "Not just private. Someone with authority filed a restriction order." They looked at each other. "Dumbledore," Harry said. "Dumbledore," she agreed. The candles burned steadily around them, and the practice room was very quiet, and in the silence of it something was taking shape that was not yet fully formed, the outline of a picture they hadn't seen completely yet, all the pieces present but the image not yet resolved. "Hermione," Harry said. "What if the compulsions aren't just suppressing me? What if they're shaping me toward something? Like, not just keeping me small but aiming me at a specific target?" She'd been thinking this since the notebook entry about the grief compulsion. She'd been thinking about it in the specific way she thought about things that frightened her, very steadily, without looking away. "I think that's likely," she said. "And I think the target is probably Voldemort." "He's not dead," Harry said, not a question. "No," she said. "I don't think he is. The books are evasive in ways that are specific to living threats, not historical ones." She paused. "And I think someone who'd gone to the trouble of compulsing an infant into a specific shape would only do that if they needed that shape for something that was still coming." Harry was quiet for a moment. "A weapon," he said. "Shaped like a boy." She didn't answer, because she didn't need to, because they were both thinking the same thing. The practice room was warm with candles and they were 11 years old, sitting in a school and supposed to be learning levitation charms and worrying about homework, and instead they were here, and the here was real and cold and large. Harry sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. And then, quietly, steadily, without performance, he said, "I'm not going to be that. Whatever he built. Whatever shape he made. I'm going to find out what I actually am, and that's what I'm going to be." She looked at him. He looked back. "That's exactly right," she said. "And we have 24 more to remove. So." She opened the Pembury text. "Next Saturday. Second cluster. Next Saturday, he said. He smiled then, properly this time, full and unguarded, the smile of someone who had just made a decision that felt, for the first time in their life, entirely their own. Outside the practice room, the castle breathed around them. And on the shelf in the headmaster's tower, the small instrument twitched again, more sharply this time, and made its discordant note, and was still. Dumbledore stood at his window for a long time. Then he sent an owl to St. Mungo's Hospital, to a specific healer in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, asking a question about the stability of long-term embedded enchantments under external interference. He did it quietly. He did it carefully. And he sent a second owl, shortly after, to Arabella Figg. Chapter 3, What they were for the second removal happened on a Tuesday. Hermione had moved it up from Saturday because of what she'd found in the restricted text she'd spent the better part of Sunday night reading under her duvet with a Lumos charm, and what she'd found was this: the intermediate strata compulsions, the 14 that sat in the cognitive layer of Harry's architecture, were beginning to destabilize. The partial removal of the outer cluster had disrupted the equilibrium of the whole system, like pulling one card from a house of cards and watching the whole structure shiver. They had a window of about 10 days before the destabilization became significant enough to cause Harry genuine cognitive distress. She'd told him Monday morning over breakfast, speaking quietly into her pumpkin juice while Ron argued with George Weasley about Quidditch 3 seats down. Harry had said, Tuesday, then, and gone back to his eggs. She'd found this reassuring. Not his calmness, she'd already identified most of his calmness as compulsion work, but the fact that even now, even with the compulsions partially disrupted and his emotional field in what the Pembury text called active resurfacing mode, he was making clear, quick decisions. The choosing. It was a real thing, not a performance. Tuesday's session ran 2.5 hours, which was 40 minutes longer than she'd planned. The intermediate strata compulsions were harder to remove than the outer layer ones, for the same reason that it was harder to remove something from the walls of a building than from the paint on the surface. They were structural in a way the behavioral suppressors hadn't been, woven through the architecture of Harry's cognition in dense, complex patterns that required her to work around active pathways rather than simply beside them. 3 times she had to stop entirely and recalibrate, backing out of a dissolution attempt because the risk of collateral disruption was too high. Harry was remarkable through it. She could feel his discomfort in the synchronization field. It came through the shared resonance as a kind of pressure, sharp and irregular, but he held the sync with a steadiness that she suspected had less to do with the compulsions and more to do with whatever he actually was underneath them, a quality she was increasingly finding herself thinking of simply as will. Raw, unconditioned will, the kind that didn't need permission to be strong. They got 9 of the 14. 5 remained, including 2 of the more complex tangled ones that she needed to study further before she touched them, and when they finally broke the synchronization and sat back in their chairs, Harry leaned forward and put his face in his hands for about 30 seconds, not speaking. She waited. When he lifted his head his eyes were very bright and his expression had the scoured quality of someone who had just had something removed that had been somewhere so long it had become part of the landscape. Math, he said. She blinked. I'm sorry. I could always do it in my head, he said. Numbers. I stopped in primary school because, he made a small gesture. I don't know why I stopped. I thought I was wrong, that I was misremembering. But he looked at the floor. I just worked out the exact duration of both sessions, the total minutes, the ratio of time spent on each compulsion cluster, and then the cubic footage of this room from visual estimation, and I don't know how I did that. Hermione was very still. That's not normal, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. Was that one of them? One of the cognitive ones? There were at least 3 in the intermediate strata that appeared to be intelligent suppressors, she said carefully. Broad-spectrum dampeners on pattern recognition, abstract reasoning, and what I think was mathematical intuition specifically. She paused. Harry. How did you do at school? At your Muggle school? He looked at her and she could see him assessing whether to be honest. Then, I failed things on purpose, he said. Regularly. Because, he stopped. Because Dudley was in the same year, and if I was obviously better at things there were consequences. She kept her expression professional with some effort. But before that? Before that I was ahead, he said quietly. My first teacher, Miss Hayward, she called my aunt in. I remember it because Aunt Petunia was so angry on the way home. Miss Hayward said I had unusual, he was pulling at a memory the way you pulled at a loose thread, carefully. Unusual aptitude. For everything. She wanted to test me. And Aunt Petunia said I was just being difficult and showing off. His voice was perfectly flat. I got an E in everything for the rest of that year. Hermione looked at the candles for a moment. Then she said, Harry. I think the intelligence suppressors weren't Dumbledore's work. He frowned. What? The three in the middle strata, the suppressors, they're slightly different in structure from the others. Older, and with a different, it's hard to explain. They have a different signature. Less precise. More, reactive. She opened her notebook. I think those three might be Petunia Dursley's work. Or someone acting on her behalf. He was very still. She'd have needed help, Hermione said. She's not a witch. But if someone had come to her, if Dumbledore had left her resources, instructions, someone she could contact, it would have been very easy to convince her that keeping Harry ordinary was in her interest. That an unusual child was a dangerous one. She already thought that, Harry said. She thought magic was, he stopped. She was afraid of it. She said it enough times. He was quiet for a moment. So Dumbledore engineered the family he left me with. Made sure they'd be, managed. Controllable. I think so. He chose them knowing what they were like. Almost certainly. Harry breathed out slowly through his nose. It was a very controlled breath, the kind that had a significant amount of something behind it that was choosing not to come out as sound. She let it be. Right, he said. Right. Okay. Moving on. She loved that about him, she decided. The moving on. Not suppression, she'd felt suppression lifted off him like a weight in these sessions, she knew exactly what suppression looked like in his magical architecture. This was just, forward momentum. A decision not to drown. They spent the rest of the session going through her notes on the remaining 5 intermediate compulsions and the 4 core-anchored ones that were still untouched, and Harry made his cramped precise notations and asked sharp questions, and they were halfway through the session when the door opened. It opened, she would think later, with the specific confidence of someone who'd been standing outside it for about 20 minutes and had finally decided to come in rather than wait to be invited. Neville Longbottom stood in the doorway. He was in his pajamas. It was 9:15 in the evening, and he had a toad in his left hand and an expression of supreme awkwardness on his face. I followed you, he said. Directly to Harry. Both times. Sorry. I was worried. Harry and Hermione looked at each other. How much did you hear? Harry said. Most of today, Neville said. He was clearly bracing for being sent away, and the brace was the practiced kind, of someone accustomed to being peripheral. Not much of the first time. The door was closed and I wasn't trying to spy, Neville, Harry said. Sit down. Neville sat, with the air of someone who'd expected a different outcome and wasn't entirely sure what to do with this one. Harry looked at him steadily. What do you think about what you heard? Neville stroked the toad, Trevor, Hermione had catalogued, with one finger, buying time. Then, I think, he said carefully, that Dumbledore's done something similar to me. Silence. My gran, Neville said. She always said I was a late developer. That my magic was weak. My uncle Algy used to drop me out of windows trying to shake it loose. He said this last part with the precise calm of someone who had integrated a very unpleasant thing by telling it enough times. And then one day I bounced, when he dropped me from the upstairs window, and everyone said, "See, there it is." And that's always been the story. Late developer. He looked up. But I've been in the library, he said. Reading about magical development. And there's no such thing, really. Magic doesn't develop late. You have it or you don't, and if you have it, it's present from infancy. He paused. So why couldn't I do anything until I was 8? Hermione looked at him with a new sharpness. He met her gaze and she saw there, behind the practiced awkwardness and the softness that everyone seemed to mistake for weakness, the same thing she'd seen in Harry's notes, someone who had been thinking about this for a long time in private and had simply never had anyone to think about it with. You've already researched it, she said. Tried to, he said. I couldn't get into the restricted section. No forged permission slip, she said. He blinked. Is that what you... Yes, she said, without particular guilt. Do you want us to look at your signature? He took a slow breath. Yes, he said. Please. She ran the Ravello Animus quietly, she was much faster with it now, a week of practice having turned what had been a careful 4-second cast into a flick, and looked at Neville's signature. It was not as complex as Harry's. There was nothing like 29 compulsions, nothing like the sophisticated multi-layer architecture she'd found in Harry. But there were 8. Sitting in the outer and intermediate layers, all of them behavioral and none of them cognitive, they weren't suppressing his intelligence, she realized, they were suppressing his confidence. His belief in himself. Creating a feedback loop where he attempted something, the compulsion dampened his power output, he failed, the failure reinforced the belief in his own weakness, and the compulsion became its own self-sustaining mechanism. It was, she thought, in some ways more vicious than what had been done to Harry. Less elaborate, but more targeted. Like someone had looked at Neville Longbottom and thought, the most efficient way to control this one is to make him control himself. She explained this to him quietly. He listened, one hand on Trevor, perfectly still. When she finished, he said, "Can you fix it?" "Yes," she said. "After Harry's done. Maybe a week or 2. "Okay," he said. And that was all, no dramatics, no emotional expression beyond a small, careful adjustment of his posture, like a man who'd been sitting slightly hunched against bad weather and had just heard it might be clearing. "What can I do now?" "To help?" Hermione looked at Harry. Harry looked at Hermione. "Research," she said. "We need to find the prophecy text. The actual content. It's been restricted but someone, somewhere, will have a copy, or a reference, or, the Hall of Prophecy," Neville said. "That's in the Ministry," Harry said. "My gran knows someone at the Ministry," Neville said. He paused. "She knows quite a lot of people at the Ministry. My parents were Aurors. Before." He said before the way people said it when there was a very large thing in the pause, a thing that everyone knew but didn't name. "She still has contacts." Hermione filed that. "Not yet," she said. "We're not ready for Ministry involvement. But keep it available." "I have something else," Neville said. He reached into the pocket of his pajamas and produced, with the slightly sheepish air of someone who'd been carrying this around waiting for the right moment, a folded piece of parchment. "I copied it out of my grand's study 2 summers ago. She doesn't know. I was looking for something about my parents, and I found it in her files." He set it on the table. "I didn't understand it then. I think I might understand it better now." Hermione unfolded it. It was a copy of a Ministry Interdepartmental Memorandum dated October 31, 1981, Halloween night, the night of the Potters. Marked classified, level 5 restricted at the top. She read it in 15 seconds and then read it again because the first reading hadn't felt real. Harry leaned over and read it too. She watched his face as he read. The memo was from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement to the Office of the Chief Warlock, Dumbledore's other title, his ministry one, the one people sometimes forgot he held in addition to being headmaster. It referenced a report filed by an unnamed field operative regarding events at Godric's Hollow. It referenced a containment protocol, classified above the standard response level. It referenced something called Directive 12. And at the bottom, in neat ministry handwriting, was a note in the margin that had been added after the original filing. It said, DT actioned. Signature confirmed. Position verified. Timeline intact. The handwriting matched, she was nearly certain, what she'd seen on official Hogwarts correspondence in her welcome letter. DT, she thought. Directive 12. What's Directive 12? Neville said. I don't know yet, she said. But I'm going to find out. She folded the memo carefully and put it in her notebook. Neville. This stays between us. Obviously, he said, with a dry precision that surprised her slightly, she'd been expecting more anxiety and was recalibrating. No, I mean, she looked at him seriously. I mean specifically, do not tell your grandmother any of this. Not yet. I don't doubt she loves you. But she and Dumbledore are, she thinks he's the greatest man alive, Neville said. Yes. I know. A pause. She'd go straight to him. Yes. I won't tell her. He stood, tucking Trevor into his pajama pocket with the practiced efficiency of long habit. Same time next week. Different time, Harry said. Different room. We'll rotate. Don't come to sessions unless we ask, it's safer if we're not seen arriving places in groups. Neville looked at Harry with the same careful assessment she recognized from herself, checking whether Harry was the kind of person whose directives were worth following not because of authority but because of competence. He seemed to find the answer satisfactory. Right, he said. Good night. He left. In the silence that followed, Harry turned to look at her and she turned to look at him, and they sat for a moment in the particular shared awareness of people who have just watched the group get larger. Is that okay? Harry said. Adding him? It's inevitable, she said. He knew. We couldn't send him away with what he knew. And he's sharper than people think. Yeah, Harry said. Much sharper. He paused. What about the memo? She opened her notebook to the fresh page. Directive 12, she said. DT. I'm going to cross-reference it against every ministry document reference I can access. There has to be something in the historical record, even if it's redacted. And if it's not in anything accessible? She looked up at him. Then we find something that isn't accessible, she said simply. He smiled. The smile faded slightly as he looked down at the notebook, at the map she'd drawn of his magical architecture with its remaining red X's. The core ones, he said. The 4 at the bottom. You said they were the riskiest. Yes. But also the most important. Structurally, yes. The core-anchored compulsions are the ones that have shaped everything else, the outer and intermediate ones are downstream effects. The core ones are the source. She paused. I want to wait until I've done more reading before we touch those. I want to be certain. How long? A week, she said. Maybe 2. He nodded, and he was looking at the map with an expression she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when he was thinking about himself as an object of study, not coldly, not detached, but with a kind of methodical honesty that she found remarkable in an 11-year-old who had every right to be a mess. Do you think I'll be different? He said. After the core ones. Significantly different. I think you'll be more yourself, she said. Whatever that means. I don't know what that means, he said. Neither do I, she said. But I think we're going to find out. Luna Lovegood found them 2 days later. This was not a case of following or surveillance or any deliberate action. Luna found them the way Luna seemed to find most things, which was by arriving somewhere as though the universe had suggested it was a good idea and she had agreed. She was in the library Thursday evening, sitting in the chair directly across from Hermione with her radish earrings and her upside-down copy of the Quibbler and her feet tucked under her, and she said, without looking up, "You're doing something about Harry's Raxburts." Hermione, who had learned over 3 days of irregular library proximity that Luna's statements benefited from translation rather than dismissal, said carefully, "What are Raxburts?" "They make your thoughts go fuzzy," Luna said. "Invisible. They float in through your ears." She turned a page. "Harry has had an unusual number of them since I met him on the train. They cluster around his head in groups." She looked up then, with the large, very clear grey eyes that were the most unsettling thing about her, because they saw in the way that most people's eyes didn't. "But they've been getting fewer. Since about 2 weeks ago." Harry, sitting across from Hermione with his charms textbook open at an angle that suggested he hadn't been reading it, said, "Luna. Do you actually believe in Raxburts, or is that just how you talk about something else?" Luna considered this with apparent seriousness. "Both," she said. "Does it matter?" "No," he said. "Good." She put the Quibbler down, right side up, and looked at both of them with the expression she always wore, serene, slightly distant, but underpinned with an attention that missed very little. "I want to help," she said. "I've been watching you not say things to people for 2 weeks and I think whatever you're not saying is probably very important and probably involves Dumbledore." Hermione looked at Harry. Harry looked at Luna. "Why," Harry said, "do you want to help?" "Because my mother died when I was 9, Luna said, "and the accident that killed her was in a room that she was only in because Dumbledore sent her there. Sent her there because he needed a test of a particular spell and chose her to conduct it because she paused. Because she was very powerful and didn't have influential friends who would ask difficult questions." The serenity of her voice didn't waver, but the air around the statement was enormous. "My father looked into it afterward. There are things that don't add up." The library hummed around them. "What kind of things?" Hermione said quietly. "The spell she was testing was on the list of prohibited experimental enchantments," Luna said. "Which means Dumbledore authorized an illegal experiment. The authorization is in the Ministry records if you know where to look. My father found it. He was going to publish it in the Quibbler." She paused. "Someone broke into our house the following month and took his notes." Hermione looked at Harry. Harry looked at Luna, and his expression had that quality she'd first seen in the practice room on Saturday, the specific, quiet, perfectly contained anger of someone who has just added a data point to a pattern and found that the pattern is worse than they thought. "Luna," he said, "can you get into the Ravenclaw library? The upper section?" "Yes," she said. "Directive 12, he said. Ministry. 1981, can you look for references?" "I can try tonight," she said. "Don't get caught." "I'm very good at not being seen," she said. And Hermione believed her, because Luna Lovegood, for all her conspicuousness, had managed to sit down directly across from Hermione in an empty library section without Hermione noticing her arrival, which was not nothing. Luna departed the same way she'd arrived, drifting, unhurried, in the direction of the Ravenclaw Tower, trailing a faint scent of something herbal. "4 of us now," Harry said. "4," Hermione agreed. "Good," he said. And she heard something in it, not just logistical satisfaction but something warmer than that. Harry Potter, she thought, making friends the way a magnet made connections, not seeking, not performing, just being genuinely himself and finding that people moved toward it. That's him, she thought. That's what's been under there this whole time. The breakthrough on Directive 12 came on Saturday. Luna had found nothing in the Ravenclaw library. The upper section contained historical records but nothing classified at ministry level. Hermione had been working her way through the public record of Wisengamot proceedings, which were technically accessible but practically buried under 200 years of procedural language, and she'd found 2 references to something called a succession directive in proceedings from 1942, which was tantalizing but not the right decade and not the right terminology. Harry found it. He'd gone to Madame Pants with a written request, in his best careful handwriting, to access the newspaper archive for late 1981, the Daily Prophet-bound volumes, which were reference materials rather than restricted ones and required only a reasonable explanation. He'd said he was doing a history of magic paper on the end of the First Wizarding War. Madame Pants had looked at him over her glasses, said nothing, and brought him 3 volumes. He'd spent 4 hours going through them page by page, and he'd come to her that evening with a folded newspaper cutting, the actual paper, fragile and slightly yellowed, which he'd carefully extracted from the archive with the specific dexterity of someone who'd spent years not being noticed while touching things he wasn't supposed to, and he'd laid it flat on the table in front of her. It was a tiny article. 3 column inches, buried in the national news section of the November 5, 1981 issue, under the headline, Wisengamot convenes emergency session, resolution passed. The article described an emergency session convened 5 days after Halloween in response to the defeat of, and here it used the period-appropriate you-know-who, at Godric's Hollow. The session, chaired by Chief Warlock Dumbledore, had passed 3 resolutions. 2 were named. The third was listed as Resolution 12-81, Classified Succession Directive, provisions sealed under Wisengamot authority. Directive 12, Harry said. Resolution 12-81. The night after Halloween, Dumbledore chaired a session and sealed something classified. 6 days before he placed you with the Dursleys, Hermione said. Right. She looked at the article. What does a succession directive cover? I looked it up, Harry said. In the Wisengamot Reference Guide. From 1965. A succession directive is a legal instrument used to assign the continuation of a duty, or a role, or an ongoing magical obligation, to a named successor, usually in the event of the death of the original party. He paused. They're rare. There are only 11 in the last 2 centuries. And they're sealed. Most of them. The ones that aren't classified are family inheritance things, bloodline succession directives, mostly old pure-blood families assigning their estates. He met her eyes. But the classified ones all have one thing in common. They're all cases where the original obligation involved something the ministry needed to continue regardless of whether the original obligated party was alive. She sat back. Someone had an obligation, she said. An ongoing magical obligation that Voldemort's disappearance threatened to interrupt. Dumbledore convened an emergency session within 24 hours to reassign it. Transfer it to a successor. To me, Harry said. The word sat between them, quiet and enormous. To you, she confirmed. An 11-month-old baby as the assigned successor to a classified magical obligation that we can't read because it's sealed under Wisengamot authority. Which Dumbledore chairs, Harry said. Which Dumbledore chairs, she said. And which he's chaired since 1956. Neville, who had come in quietly 20 minutes ago and had been sitting in the corner with Trevor and his own notebook, listening, said, My parents were Aurors. Both of them looked at him. They were Aurors, he said again, more slowly. They were tortured into insanity by Bellatrix Lestrange. Everyone knows that. He paused. But the official record says they were tortured for information. What information? About what? Aurors are debriefed, their knowledge is classified, there's a protocol. What specific knowledge did Bellatrix need badly enough to use the Cruciatus until, he stopped. What if it wasn't about information, he said quietly. What if it was about something they'd found out? The candles were very still. Your parents were investigating something, Hermione said. I think so, he said. I think they found something and I think Dumbledore knew they'd found it, and I think, he stopped. I think I'm not ready to finish that sentence yet. Because finishing it means Dumbledore let it happen, Harry said. Not cruelly, just clearly. The way Harry said hard things, which was directly. Neville looked at him. Yes, he said. That's what it means. The room was very quiet. Harry looked at the newspaper cutting. Then at Hermione's notebook. Then at Neville. Then out at the middle distance, in the specific way of someone assembling a picture in their head, arranging pieces, finding where they fit. He needed the war to keep going, Harry said. Voldemort was useful to him. Not winning, but present. Threatening. While Voldemort was a threat, Dumbledore was necessary. While Dumbledore was necessary, he had power. Real power, not just Hogwarts headmaster, not just Order of the Merlin, but Wizengamot chair, supreme mugwump, the single most trusted individual in the entire magical world. He paused. And then Voldemort went and almost died, and the war nearly ended on its own, without Dumbledore. Without his plan. And so he needed a way to bring it back, Hermione said. He needed a controlled end, Harry said. Not a messy, accidental one. He looked at the notebook, at the map with its remaining red X's. He needed me to be the thing that ended it. Specifically. On his terms. Under his control. A weapon, Neville said softly. A weapon shaped like a martyr, Harry said. Because that's the thing that makes you permanently indispensable, isn't it? If you engineer the circumstances of the victory. If the battle happens the way you designed it to happen. If Harry Potter walks into the final confrontation already shaped to sacrifice himself and it works, his voice was entirely level. Then Dumbledore is the man who won the war. Who prepared the weapon. Who guided the hero to the right death at the right moment. And the hero is very conveniently dead, Hermione said. And can't contradict anyone's version of events. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, the kind that exists after a very large and ugly thing has been said aloud for the first time and the air is still adjusting to the shape of it. Harry sat back. He was not shaking. He was not falling apart. He was doing what she'd watched him do in the practice room, making room for it, deciding he could carry it, moving forward. Right, he said. So. What we actually need, before we do anything else, is the text of the prophecy. The actual content. Because everything else is inference and I am done being a piece in someone else's theory. Agreed, Hermione said. And the succession directive, Neville said. The actual text. That too. She was writing quickly, her hand moving in her characteristic dense, rapid script. And before any of that, we need to finish the removals. Because everything we're doing right now, we're doing with Harry at partial capacity. She looked up. Harry. The remaining compulsions, the 5 cognitive ones and the 4 core ones. I want to do them this week. All of them. The 5 cognitives and 2 of the core ones this week, she said. The last 2 core ones when we're ready. She met his eyes. Because I think once you have full access to yourself, the strategy becomes significantly more effective. You've been 3/4 present this entire time and you're already the sharpest person in this room. Debatable, Harry said. Politely debatable, she said. The point is. Full capacity. Soon. Wednesday, he said. Can you be ready by Wednesday? I'm already ready, she said, because she'd been preparing the Wednesday framework in her notebook for 4 days on the working assumption that they'd need it. He smiled at her then, the real one, the unguarded one, with the particular quality of someone who is genuinely pleased and not performing any version of being pleased. There's one more thing, Luna said. Everyone looked at her. She had appeared sometime in the last 10 minutes, Hermione genuinely could not identify the moment of her arrival, and was sitting cross-legged on the floor near the wall, the Quibbler in her lap and Trevor sitting on the cover with an air of settled permanence. I was in the Ollery yesterday, she said. I was sending a letter to my father. And I saw, there's a room next to the Ollery that I think most students don't use because you have to know the password, which I found by accident because passwords that are written down near doors are easy to find. She was describing a crime with the serenity of a nature documentary. Inside there's a mirror. It's not catalogued in any of the Hogwarts records. I looked. It's just there. And the mirror, she held up the quibbler. She'd drawn a diagram on the inside cover in what appeared to be purple ink. It was a mirror shape, roughly, with lines emanating from it in a specific pattern. Hermione looked at the pattern. It was not a coincidence that the pattern matched, almost exactly, the directional geometry of the tethers she'd found in Harry's diagnostic scan. The angle. The orientation. The north-pointing vector. The mirror is a monitoring device, Hermione said. It's what he's using to watch the compulsions. I think so, Luna said. It smells like old magic. The kind that's been running for a long time without anyone maintaining it. Can you find your way back to it? Harry said. Yes, Luna said. Don't touch it, Hermione said quickly. Not yet. But, she looked at Harry. If we can access the mirror. If we can read it, we can see what he's been watching, Harry said. And how much he knows, Neville said. Hermione wrote in her notebook, mirror. Ollery adjacent. Wednesday, check after session. One question, Harry said, to the room in general. He wasn't looking at anyone specifically, just at the space between them, the shared territory they'd been building together over these weeks. When we've got everything, the prophecy, the directive, the compulsions removed, the mirror's data. When we've got all of it. He looked up. What do we actually do with it? The question hung there. We don't hide, Hermione said. She'd been thinking about this since the first night in the library, since the moment she'd decided not to go to a teacher, not because the truth wasn't worth telling but because the channels couldn't be trusted. We don't fight underground forever. At some point we take it somewhere it can be seen. She paused. The Wizengamot is Dumbledore's, but there are members who aren't. Individual members who have reasons to, my grandmother, Neville said quietly. She hates Dumbledore. I think. He paused. I've always thought she trusted him because everyone does. But actually, I've watched her face when his name comes up in certain contexts. And it's not trust. It's something else. Fear. Luna said. Pragmatism, Neville said. She thinks he's necessary. That's different from trusting him. Then she might be exactly the person we need, Hermione said. Eventually, Harry said. After Wednesday. After the core removals. After we know the full picture. He looked at his hands, the hands that had been holding hers through every session, that had gripped tight and then deliberately released. I want to know what I am, he said. All of it. Before I sit in front of any adult and make a case. I want to know every piece of this. He paused. And I want the compulsions gone. All 29. I want them completely gone. And then, he looked up. And then I want to look Dumbledore in the face. The candles burned. Somewhere above them the castle settled on its foundations, the deep shifting of old stone that happened at night when the temperature dropped. And in the distance, barely audible, the great clock in the entrance hall began to strike the hour. 10 o'clock. Wednesday, Hermione said. Wednesday, Harry agreed. Chapter 4, The Reluctant Potions Master. Wednesday's session was the longest yet. 4 hours and 17 minutes, during which Hermione dismantled 5 cognitive compulsions and 2 of the 4 core-anchored ones, and by the end of it Harry was sitting on the floor of the practice room with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up and his eyes very bright and completely open, looking at the room around him like someone who had just taken off a pair of glasses they hadn't known they were wearing. She sat across from him on the floor, her back against the opposite wall, her notebook in her lap. Her hands were shaking slightly. She'd been holding synchronization for 4 hours across some of the most complex dissolution work she'd ever attempted. The core compulsions were dense in a way that defied metaphor, were load-bearing in the way she'd predicted, had tendrils worked so deep into the architecture of Harry's magical core that 3 times she'd had to back out completely and find a different angle. The last one had taken 40 minutes by itself. She was completely drained. Neither of them said anything for a while. The candles had burned down to stubs. The room smelled of spent wax and something ozone-sharp that always lingered after significant magical work. "Say something," Hermione said finally, because the silence had a weight to it she couldn't quite read. Harry looked at her. His eyes, she thought, were different. Not in any visible physical way, the green was the same green, the scar the same scar, but the quality of attention behind them had shifted. She'd thought he'd been present before, after the first removal. She'd thought the second and third sessions had been bringing him forward. She understood now that she'd been watching someone wake up in increments, and this was the nearest thing to fully awake she'd seen yet. "I know," he said, "how to do 17 spells I've never been taught." She blinked. "What?" "Not consciously." "Not, I haven't read them anywhere. But they're just," he flexed his right hand, opened it, looked at his palm. "They're there. Like someone put books on a shelf and then told me the shelf didn't exist and now I can see it. All the books. I know what they are." He paused. "That's not normal, is it?" "No," she said. No. Harry, magical knowledge doesn't work that way. You can't have inherent access to spells you haven't. "I know I shouldn't," he said, not defensively. "I'm just telling you what's there." She looked at him. Thought about the enormous core she'd seen in his diagnostic field, larger than anything she'd found in any recorded reference, and thought about what core-anchored compulsions at that level would actually suppress. Not just behavior. Not just cognition. The actual depth of him. The actual reservoir. "Can you show me?" she said. He held his right hand out, palm up, and did something she couldn't exactly describe, not wand movement, because he didn't have his wand out, just a quality of intention, focused and precise, and a small pale fire ignited in his palm. Not a candle flame. Not a match flame. A structured, geometrically perfect tetrahedron of cold white fire that rotated slowly on its axis and gave off no heat. She looked at it for a long time. "I don't know what that is," she said honestly. "Neither do I," he said. "But I know how to do it." He closed his hand and it was gone. "And there are 16 more." She wrote in her notebook, "Post-removal emergence. Inherent magical knowledge. Possible ancestral encoding, research Potter bloodline. Core compulsions may have been suppressing inherited magical memory, not just power output." She underlined research Potter bloodline 3 times. They sat on the floor for another 10 minutes, both of them quietly processing, and then Harry said, "The last 2. "Not tonight," she said. I know," he said. "Not tonight." "I know." He wasn't pushing, just noting. Pointing at the remaining distance. "How long?" "A week," she said. "Maybe less. I need to rebuild the framework. The last 2 are the ones I haven't fully mapped yet. The really old ones." She paused. "Harry, I think the last 2 were placed before you were born." He went very still. "I found evidence of prenatal anchoring in the diagnostic field last Tuesday," she said. "The tether geometry is, they're not anchored to your personal magical core. They're anchored to your bloodline. Whoever placed them didn't target you, specifically. They targeted the magical lineage, and when you came along as the next expression of that lineage," she spread her hands. "They transferred automatically," he said. "I think so. Which means they might not be Dumbledore's work," he said. "Which means they might not be Dumbledore's work," she agreed. "And I want to know whose they are before I take them apart." He nodded slowly. "Right. Good." He ran a hand through his already thoroughly disordered hair. "I'm going to go eat something. And then sleep. And tomorrow I'm going to find out what the mirror shows us." She said. "We're going to find out." He looked at her and there was something warm in it, uncomplicated warmth, the kind that wasn't performing anything. He agreed. He left. She stayed in the practice room for another 10 minutes, rebuilding the candles and running through her framework notes, and was halfway through cleaning up when the door opened. Severus Snape walked in. He looked at the room, the burned-down candles, the 2 chairs in the center, the chalk diagram she'd laid out on the floor for the synchronization work and hadn't yet cleaned up. His gaze moved across it the way his gaze moved across her library books, quickly, precisely, cataloging everything in about 3 seconds. Then he looked at her. She looked back. "Miss Granger," he said. "Professor Snape." He stepped into the room and shut the door behind him with the careful quiet of someone who has thought about what they're about to say for several days and has decided to say it from a position of maximum information. He looked at the chalk diagram on the floor for a long moment. "Pembury synchronization geometry," he said. "Modified. You've adjusted the outer vertices by approximately 15 degrees. He tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "The standard geometry is optimized for adult practitioners," she said. "We're 11. The resonance frequency required to," she stopped. She was answering a question from the person she'd been avoiding confirming anything to, and she was doing it because the question was technically interesting and her instincts about technically interesting questions were slightly faster than her instincts about personal security. "Required to safely synchronize across the significant power differential between yourself and Potter," Snape finished. He looked up from the diagram. "Yes. Pembury's geometry assumes equivalent power output from both practitioners. The modification is correct." He paused. "You should have moved the inner circle closer to the north vertex by another 3 degrees. The current configuration puts the synchronization field slightly off-center relative to the subject's core orientation." She stared at him. "You've been doing this for how long?" he said. She caught herself. "Why are you here?" "I have been following the trace signatures of Pembury dissolution work through the castle for 2 weeks, he said. Pembury dissolution leaves a specific magical residue. Rather like following the smell of a very particular and unusual cooking process." He clasped his hands behind his back. "I have also been monitoring the diagnostic instruments in my office that I have keyed to Potter's magical signature since his first year began." The cold, specific alertness that was Hermione's version of fight or flight said, "Stop talking." She stopped talking. "I am not here to interfere with what you're doing," Snape said. His voice had its usual precise quality but something else underneath it, not warmth, she didn't think it was warmth exactly, but something that was in the neighborhood. Something effortful. "I am going to say several things. They will be said once. You will not ask me to repeat them or to explain the motivations behind them beyond what I choose to share." She folded her hands on her notebook. "All right," she said. "Potter's compulsions have been known to me since his first diagnostic at Hogwarts, a diagnostic conducted automatically on all entering students, of which the records are kept in my office, not the headmaster's." He paused. "I did not act on this knowledge immediately for reasons that are my own. I am acting on it now because the timeline has been accelerated by your intervention, and because the core removals you conducted tonight have," he stopped. "Started again. The cascade effect of a core removal at Potter's power level is not trivial. There will be external signs. People who are watching will notice." "Dumbledore," she said. "Dumbledore," he confirmed. "He does not know the extent of what you've done." "Not yet. He is aware that something is disrupting the compulsion architecture. His monitoring instruments have been giving him irregular readings for a fortnight." The faintest, most controlled flicker of something crossed his face. He has attributed it, thus far, to natural magical maturation. He will stop attributing it to that within approximately, he seemed to calculate, 4 days. Why 4 days? Because in 4 days he has a routine check-in with his monitoring system. It is calendared. He does it quarterly. He looked at her. "You have 4 days to complete the removal." She felt the urgency of this as a physical thing, a tightening in her chest. The last two are prenatal anchored, she said. Bloodline tethered. I don't know whose they are or how to safely. I know whose they are, Snape said. She looked at him. They are the headmasters, he said. Placed before James and Lily Potter were married, at a point when Dumbledore had identified the Potter bloodline as significant, for reasons related to a prophecy I will not discuss tonight. He anchored them to the bloodline then, so that whoever the next significant Potter proved to be, the Compulsions would transfer at conception. His voice was entirely flat. It is among the most sophisticated and methodical acts of preemptive control I have encountered in 30 years of studying the dark arts. The room was very quiet. You said you won't discuss the prophecy, Hermione said carefully. Not tonight, he said. Tonight we discuss the removal. Can they be removed safely? With the correct modification to the dissolution framework, yes. He reached into his robes and produced a folded piece of parchment, which he held out to her. She took it. It was covered in dense handwriting, diagrams, what appeared to be a heavily modified version of the Pembury inner circle geometry. The prenatal anchoring requires a third practitioner in the synchronization field. The power distribution is, he paused. It requires more than 2 people. She looked at the parchment. You're offering to be the third. I am offering the theoretical framework, he said. What you do with it is your business. She looked at him. He met her gaze with his usual expression, which was the expression of someone who had decided that not having an expression was preferable to having one, but she was learning to read the edges of it. Why, she said. Your own reasons, I know, but, some of them. Give me some of them. He was silent for a long moment. Not the silence of someone refusing to answer, but of someone choosing their answer carefully from a range of true options. I knew his mother, he said finally. Lily Potter. I knew her, well. For a long time. Another pause. She would have, he stopped. Began again, with a different angle of approach. What has been done to her son is not something she would have permitted. And she is not here to prevent it. And I am. He said it with the flatness of someone filing a simple fact, but the fact was enormous, and they both knew it. Hermione looked at the parchment. Then back at him. For days, she said. For days, he confirmed. If I need the third practitioner, she said slowly. If the framework requires it, send a note to my office, he said. After hours. Unsigned. He moved to the door, paused, half-turned. The mirror near the Ollery, he said. She went very still. I am aware of it, he said. Don't touch it. Not yet. It has a secondary alarm function that is not obvious from visual inspection. He looked at her directly. The interior surface contains a recording of every compulsion check Dumbledore has conducted in the last 10 years. 11 years. You cannot access it directly. But I can. He opened the door. I'll provide the recordings through the same channel. After hours. Unsigned. He left. She sat in the empty room for a very long time after, the parchment in her hands, the chalk diagram on the floor, the burned-down candles. She read through the framework modifications twice, and they were brilliant, not her level brilliant but a different kind, the kind born from decades of understanding that was applied with economy and precision, not a wasted word or redundant diagram anywhere on the page. She wrote in her notebook, Snape knows. Helping. Don't ask why again, answer already given. Trust provisionally. Verify everything. She underlined verify everything, because she was Hermione Granger and that was what she did. She found Harry at breakfast the next morning, Thursday, 3 days before Dumbledore's quarterly check, and sat next to him with her parchment folded inside her History of Magic textbook and said quietly, "We have a problem and a solution. The solution involves a person you probably won't like." Harry looked at her. Snape. She stared at him. "How did you? He's been watching me strangely for 2 weeks," Harry said. In a different way from how he usually watches me strangely. The usual way is about my father. The new way is about this. He spooned porridge without looking at it. What did he say? She told him, concisely, speaking into her pumpkin juice and her toast while Ron was distracted by an owl delivering a package from his mother. Harry listened with his spoon moving in steady circles in his bowl and his eyes on the table. When she finished, he said, he was her friend. So it seems. Before or after they were at school? I think during, she said. And then something went wrong. I don't know the details. Harry was quiet for a moment. But he still, yes, she said. He nodded slowly. Right. If he can anchor the third position in the sync field, it means we can do the last two safely, she said. Without risking a fracture. When? Tonight, if you're ready, she said. I think we have to be. Tonight, he said. She sent the note at noon. Unsigned, as instructed. She used her non-dominant hand for the writing, an extra precaution that she was mildly embarrassed about but included anyway. Snape's reply came back within 10 minutes, also unsigned, Classroom 3. 8 o'clock. Come alone until you arrive. Harry and Hermione stood outside Classroom 3 at 7:58, which was as close to alone until arriving as she could rationalize. The corridor was empty and the door was already slightly open, a thin bar of amber light falling across the stone floor. Inside, Snape had arranged the chairs differently from her setup. The third practitioner framework required a triangular configuration, one chair for Harry at the north, one for Hermione at the southeast, one for himself at the southwest. The geometry was mathematically precise, she could see he'd measured it. There were no candles. Instead, 3 low-burning lanterns at each corner of the triangle, which she recognized from the framework diagram as anchor points for the synchronization field. Snape was standing at the back of the room when they entered. He looked at Harry in the specific way she'd observed before, the surface hostility present but the understructure of it complicated by something he clearly had no interest in performing. Harry looked back at him with an expression of calm appraisal that was entirely new to Hermione's catalogue of hairy faces, and which seemed to disconcert Snape slightly in the way that only being seen clearly ever disconcerts anyone. Mr. Potter, Snape said. Professor, Harry said. I want to say something before we start. Snape's expression shifted fractionally, the brace of someone who is expecting sentiment and has pre-decided to find it unpleasant. I don't expect anything from you, Harry said. And I'm not going to thank you for your reasons, because your reasons are yours. But I'm grateful for the help. That's just true regardless of the reasons. Snape looked at him for a moment. Then he said, very precisely, sit down. They sat. The third practitioner synchronization was more complex than anything Hermione had built before. She followed the framework exactly, laying down her resonance, taking Snape's offered field connection with the slightly strange sensation of synchronizing with a magical signature that was simultaneously very controlled and extremely large. She hadn't realized how large Snape's core was because he kept it so tightly reined in that the restraint itself obscured the depth. It was like looking at a still pond and only realizing after a moment that it was extremely deep. She built the triangle. Harry's field completed the third point, and when all 3 locked together the synchronization that resulted was qualitatively different from anything she'd felt in the practice room, stronger, more stable, with a kind of harmonic depth that the 2-person sync had lacked. She could feel the entire architecture of Harry's magical core with a clarity that was almost like looking at something in daylight after weeks of candlelight. She found the last 2 compulsions. They were exactly as Snape had described. Prenatal anchoring, bloodline tethered, with a specific structure that was different from all the others, not cruder, not more refined, but older in a particular way. Deliberately ancient feeling, like someone had intentionally built them with the vocabulary of very old magic to make them harder to identify as deliberate construction rather than inherent structure. She looked at them for a long moment before she touched them, making sure. Then she started. The first of the 2 took 25 minutes. It was not the most technically difficult of the removals, the modified framework made it cleaner than she'd feared, but it was the most profound. She felt it go not as a release or an unraveling but as a very deep, tectonic shift, something enormous moving at the base of Harry's magical architecture. The synchronization field absorbed the discharge and distributed it, and Snape on the southwest vertex held his position without flinching, which she noted and filed away for future consideration. The second one took 15 minutes. And when it came apart, when the last knot in the last compulsion in a network of 29 that had been built across 11 years and before them, across a lifetime of deliberate engineering, the release was not dramatic. It was quiet. A very deep, very final quiet, like the moment after a note has been played and the room is still processing the sound. Harry sat in his chair and breathed. For a long moment he was perfectly still, and Hermione and Snape held the synchronization without speaking, and the lanterns burned. Then Harry opened his eyes. She had seen him open his eyes after every session. She had been cataloging the changes, noting each incremental resurfacing. This was different. This was not incremental. His eyes opened and there was a quality to it that was, she reached for a word and found, complete. There was nothing muted about him. Nothing filtered. Nothing filtered or managed or redirected or suppressed. The depth of him was entirely present in his face, and it was staggering, not frightening, not overwhelming, just, completely, undeniably real in a way that everything had been slightly not real about him before. He looked at her first. Then at Snape. Then, with what seemed like curiosity more than anything else, he reached out his right hand, the wandless one, and the pale geometric fire from Wednesday's session appeared again. But this time it wasn't a single tetrahedron. It was a structure, interconnected, complex, 7 distinct shapes rotating in a precise orbital pattern, and it was throwing light around the room, actual steady light, white and clean. Snape stared at it. Harry looked at it himself with an expression of pure, unself-conscious interest. Then he let it go, and the room returned to lantern light, and he looked at Snape and said, "I have some questions." "I imagine you do," Snape said. His voice was very controlled. "Not all tonight," Harry said. "Some tonight. The most important ones." He paused. "The prophecy. What does it actually say?" Snape was quiet for a moment. She watched him weigh things, the cost of telling versus the cost of not, the careful calculation of someone who had spent decades making exactly these kinds of calculations and had learned something from each one. "The prophecy," he said, "was made by Sybil Trelawney in the presence of Albus Dumbledore in the spring of 1980. It was heard, in part, by a then unnamed Death Eater who was eavesdropping at the door." He paused. "That Death Eater was myself." Neither Hermione nor Harry moved. "I heard the first half," he said. "I reported it to the Dark Lord. This was, not a decision I have since found comfort in." His voice was the flattest she'd heard it, the flatness of someone pressing down on something with everything they have. "The second half I did not hear. The door was closed before the prophecy concluded." "Which means Voldemort only ever had half of it," Hermione said slowly. "Correct. Which means his interpretation of it was, limited." "And Dumbledore has the full text," Harry said. "Dumbledore has the full text, sealed in the Department of Mysteries," Snape said. "And the partial version he shared with the Dark Lord, deliberately shared, I now believe, through channels he could have controlled, was sufficient to set events in motion. The attack on Godric's Hollow. He stopped. The death of my parents," Harry said. Flat. Direct. Snape's expression did not change but something moved behind it. "Yes," he said. "He let it happen," Harry said. "He knew Voldemort had the partial prophecy because he was the source of it. And he let him act on it." "I believe so," Snape said quietly. Harry looked at the floor for a moment. Just a moment. Then he looked up. "The succession directive," he said. "What was the obligation that was being transferred?" Snape looked at him. The obligation, he said slowly, of being the one to end the conflict. The designated terminus. In Dumbledore's plan, there is a specific mechanism by which Voldemort can be permanently destroyed. It requires the sacrifice of the individual who carries the terminal component of that mechanism. He paused. The succession directive ensured that in the event the original designated terminus, which was not you, initially, was unavailable, the obligation would transfer to the next appropriate bloodline candidate. I'm supposed to die, Harry said. Again, flat and direct, with the terrible clarity of someone who has been building toward this sentence for 3 weeks and is not surprised to arrive at it. You were supposed to die, Snape said. At the correct moment. Under controlled circumstances. In a way that would permanently destroy Voldemort's ability to, he paused. There is a piece of his soul in you. In your scar. Placed there inadvertently during the attack at Godric's Hollow. Dumbledore has known this since shortly after. He looked at Harry directly. The plan requires you to willingly accept death, at which point the soul fragment is destroyed along with you. And then, in theory, you would be returned, because the act of sacrifice, in theory, Harry said. In theory, Snape repeated. The projections suggest a high probability of return. Not certainty. The room was very quiet. Hermione was writing. She was writing because she was Hermione Granger, and writing was how she processed enormity without losing the thread of it, and the enormity here was quite large enough to drown in if she let it. Harry sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He was quiet for a long, extended moment during which she could almost feel him taking the shape of what he'd just been told and finding the place for it, not accepting it, not consigning himself to it, just knowing it. Seeing it completely. Then he looked at Snape. And he said, I'm not going to do that. Snape said nothing. Not the dying under Dumbledore's control version, Harry said. Not the surrender myself to his timeline and his terms version. I understand there may be something in my scar that needs to be dealt with. I understand Voldemort isn't gone and probably needs to be dealt with. I'll deal with those things. He paused. On my terms. In my own time. Without being a planned casualty in someone else's story. She looked at him. His voice was completely steady. No anger in it, something cleaner and more absolute than anger, the tone of someone making a statement about the shape of their own life that they have no intention of arguing about. Snape looked at him for a very long time. Then, he said finally, you will need to find a way to remove the soul fragment without dying. Which is, not a documented procedure. I know, Harry said. But I also knew 17 spells I'd never been taught before I was 11, and I can make geometric fire with my bare hands, so I think undocumented procedures and I are probably going to be acquainted. He paused. Will you help? With the research. Not as a teacher and not out of obligation. Just, he looked at Snape directly. You know more about the dark arts than anyone I'm likely to find. I need that knowledge. Snape was quiet for a long moment. I will provide access to my private library, he said. Which contains materials not available elsewhere in this castle. He stood, moving to collect the lanterns, his movements precise and deliberate. You will not mention this to anyone outside your current circle. You will not come to my office in daylight or in view of other students. And, he paused with his back to them. You will not speak to me about his mother. Not yet. All right, Harry said. Without pushing. Snape nodded, once, and put the last lantern out. In the dark before their eyes adjusted, Hermione heard him say quietly, she would have been very proud of both of you. By the time the light from the corridor was enough to see by, he was gone. They walked back through the castle slowly, Harry and Hermione, through the half-lit corridors and the sleeping portraits and the particular nighttime silence of a very old building full of very young people. Somewhere above them a ghost drifted through a wall. Somewhere below, a cat was pursuing something through the kitchen corridor. 29, Harry said. All gone. All gone, she said. I feel, he paused for a long time. Enormous, he said finally. Not arrogantly, the word of someone describing something factual about the weather. Like I've been in a very small room my whole life and I didn't know there was a bigger one. What are you going to do with it? She said. Everything, he said simply. But first, he glanced at her. Dumbledore's quarterly check is in 3 days. He's going to look at his instruments and know the compulsions are gone. Yes. We need to be ready for that. I know. She'd been building the response framework in her head since Snape mentioned the 4-day window. We need the mirror data. We need the prophecy text. We need the succession directive. And we need to, she paused. We need Neville's grandmother. Not yet, he said. First I want to look at him. Dumbledore. I want to see him when he knows. I want to see his face. She looked at Harry sideways. Why? Because I want to know what he does when he can't manage me anymore, Harry said. Before we go to anyone with evidence, before we make any move, I want to see what he does when his plan doesn't work the way he designed it to. I want to see what Albus Dumbledore looks like when he loses control of something. She thought about this. Then, that's either very clever or very dangerous. Both, Harry said. Probably. He glanced at her with the corner of his mouth pulling up. Good thing I'm not afraid of either. She looked at him, this boy who 3 weeks ago had been quiet and humble and managed and who was now walking through his own school like someone who had just remembered they owned the place, not with arrogance but with the specific settled confidence of something that has finally found its natural shape, and thought, here he is. Here's the one who was always there. Tomorrow, she said. We go to the mirror. Get the data. Give it to Snape to access the recordings. And then Saturday morning, Harry said. I'm going to do something I should have done when I was 11 months old. He paused. I'm going to introduce myself. To who? He looked at her. To everyone, he said. In the headmaster's tower, at 10:02, a glass instrument on a shelf went suddenly and completely silent for the first time in 11 years. Not disrupted, not irregular, silent. Empty. The monitoring signal it had been designed to track simply ceased to exist, because the things it had been monitoring were no longer there. Dumbledore sat at his desk. He was writing, a letter, long and patient, the kind of correspondence that existed between people who had known each other for 50 years and communicated in a shorthand that contained more in the silences between words than in the words themselves. He stopped writing. He looked at the instrument. He sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he set down his quill, folded his hands on the desk, and looked at the wall above the sleeping portraits of his predecessors, with the expression of someone who has just watched an enormously complex machine produce an unexpected output and is now revising every assumption they'd built around it. Oh, Harry, he said quietly. Not angrily. Not threateningly. With something that was, in its way, genuinely complicated, something almost like recognition, or grief, or respect. What have you done? He sat for another long moment. Then he picked up his quill, turned to a fresh piece of parchment, and began a new letter. This one was shorter. The handwriting was different, faster, less elegant, the handwriting of someone writing under the mild but real pressure of something that has just become urgent. It was addressed to an office in the Ministry of Magic. It was not about Harry Potter, not directly. It was about a room in the Department of Mysteries. And it was marked, at the top, in his own precise script, time-sensitive. Please respond by Friday. Chapter 5, The Trial That Wasn't the Mirror Room Smelled Like Time. That was the only way Hermione could describe it, the concentrated, slightly sweet staleness of a space that had been sealed for a very long time with something old and active inside it, like finding a clock that had been running in a locked room for decades. Luna had led them there Thursday morning before breakfast, through a maintenance corridor behind the Ollery that most students apparently never noticed because it was partly concealed by a tapestry of a map of Scandinavia and the door handle looked like a torch bracket. The password was written on the back of the tapestry in faded ink. Luna had found it in approximately 30 seconds. Inside, the mirror stood against the far wall, about 5 feet tall, framed in dark wood carved with interlocking geometric shapes that Hermione recognized from her reading on monitoring enchantments as containment geometry. The decorative element was functional, keeping the recording field inside the mirror's surface rather than bleeding into the surrounding space. The mirror's face was dark and slightly reflective, showing them their own faint images but nothing else. Luna stood in front of it with her head tilted slightly and her radish earrings catching the faint light from the corridor. "It knows we're here," she said. "You say that like it's thinking," Neville said. "Old monitoring enchantments sometimes develop something like that," Hermione said. "Responsiveness to presence. It's not consciousness, it's just accumulated function." She looked at it carefully from a distance, not approaching yet. "Snape said there's a secondary alarm. Can anyone see the trigger mechanism?" Harry walked around the mirror's left side, then its right, looking at the frame geometry. He moved differently now. She'd been observing it since Wednesday, the quality of his movement, the way he occupied space. It was not aggressive or territorial, just, completely present, the way a very good chess player occupied a room. He didn't waste anything. "Bottom right corner," he said. "The third symbol from the base, it's got a different depth to it. Carved deeper. That's not decorative." She came and looked. He was right. The symbol was a monitoring glyph with a reactive trigger, touched the mirror surface without disarming it and the glyph would fire. She looked at it closely, pulled out her notebook, sketched it. Then she wrote a quick note, folded it, and handed it to Luna. "Can you get this to Snape's office without being seen?" Luna took the note. "Yes," she said, and was gone with a completeness that still slightly startled Hermione even after a week of it. They waited. Neville sat on the floor with Trevor. Harry stood looking at the mirror with an expression that was partly his new default, that deep, clear attention, and partly something else, something she'd started to identify as him processing his own reflection without the filters that had always stood between him and the fact of himself. "What do you see?" she said. He glanced at her. "A boy in a corridor," he said. "Which is what I am." A pause. "It's enough." She smiled despite herself. Snape arrived 11 minutes later, appearing around the tapestry with the silence that was simply how he moved, carrying a small leather case and wearing an expression of pointed displeasure that she was beginning to understand was his default rather than a specific reaction to them. He looked at the mirror. He looked at the trigger glyph she'd sketched in her notebook, which she held up for him. He nodded once, reached into the leather case, and produced a thin rod of something that looked like crystallized copper. "Stand back," he said. "All of you. 3 feet minimum." They stood back. He worked on the trigger glyph for about 4 minutes, making small precise movements with the copper rod that she couldn't quite follow, and then he stood back himself and said, "It's disarmed. The surface is safe to contact." He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the mirror's face. The dark surface bloomed with light. What came out of it was not a single image but a sequence, recordings, exactly as Snape had said, layered and indexed by date, each one a brief window into the same event. Dumbledore, in his tower, standing before a smaller version of the same mirror, looking into it. Checking. Each recording was the visual equivalent of a diagnostic reading, his expression, and in the reflection of the mirror in a mirror, the ghost image of Harry's compulsion architecture as Dumbledore saw it from the outside. There were 43 recordings over 11 years. They watched them in sequence, crouched around Snape's unfolded leather case, which turned out to contain a playback surface for exactly this kind of recording. The images were small and slightly grainy but clear enough. The early ones, from 1982, 1983, 1984, showed Dumbledore looking satisfied. The compulsions were intact, stable, growing properly into the developing architecture around them. He would check them, note something in a small book, and move on with the brisk efficiency of someone reviewing a long-term project that is progressing on schedule. The middle ones were more interesting. 1989, 1990, 1991, you could see him watching the compulsions bed deeper, watching the behavioral and cognitive filters take hold, and she could see, even in the small grainy playback image, the particular quality of his satisfaction. It wasn't the satisfaction of cruelty. That was the thing that kept stopping her. It was the satisfaction of engineering, of something built precisely, performing exactly as designed. He looked at Harry the way an architect might look at a building. That was, in some ways, worse. The last recording was from September 1st, the day the Hogwarts Express had left King's Cross. The day Harry had arrived at school. Dumbledore had checked the mirror that morning, early, before the students arrived. The compulsions had been intact and stable, all 29 of them, and his expression had been, settled. A man with a long plan in its final phase, all pieces in position. Harry watched this last recording without expression. When it ended he sat back on his heels and said, "He doesn't hate me." "No," Hermione said. "It would be easier if he did," Harry said. Not bitterly, analytically. Then it would be, personal. This isn't personal. He just needed a specific shaped tool and I was the available material. He looked at the blank mirror. "I think that's actually more offensive." "It should be," Neville said, with a quiet intensity that reminded her he had his own version of this story, his own parents, his own 8 compulsions. "Right," Harry said. He stood. "Okay. We have the recordings. What else do we need before we can move?" "The prophecy text," Hermione said. "The actual words. We have Snape's account of the first half, but I want the full text." "The Hall of Prophecy," Neville said, "is not accessible to first-year students," Snape said, with the tone of someone closing a door. "Is it accessible to former members of the Order of the Phoenix?" Harry said. Snape looked at him. "What do you know about the Order of the Phoenix?" "I know it existed," Harry said. "I know Dumbledore ran it during the war. I know several of the Hogwarts professors were members. I know my parents were members." He paused. "I know you were a member." Snape said nothing. "I know the Order had access to certain ministry resources that weren't publicly available," Harry said. "Including, I suspect, parts of the Department of Mysteries." He met Snape's gaze. "I'm not asking you to break into the ministry. I'm asking whether there's a legitimate channel, whether there's someone in the Order who still has standing to access a prophecy record." Snape was quiet for a moment. Then, "Alastor Moody," he said, like a man walking slowly out onto uncertain ice. "He retains ministry clearance. And he is," another pause, "not entirely uncritical of certain recent Dumbledore decisions. Can you contact him without Dumbledore knowing?" "Possibly." He looked like he found this conversation extremely unpleasant, and was having it anyway. "I will need time. We have 3 days before Dumbledore's quarterly check," Hermione said. "Roughly." "I'm aware of the timeline," Snape said drily. "Give me tonight." He came back to them Friday morning with 3 things: a contact established with Moody, who had apparently received Snape's inquiry with the specific gruffness of someone who had been waiting for something like it, a copy of a sealed document he'd extracted from his personal archive that turned out to be a pre-war magical contract between Dumbledore and the Potter family regarding something called a Fidelius extension, and a small folded piece of paper on which was written, in Snape's precise handwriting, the full text of the prophecy. All of it. They read it in Harry's dormitory at 6 in the morning, sitting on his bed with the curtains drawn and Neville's Lumos charm held steady over the page. "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives." The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the 7th month dies. Hermione read it twice. Then sat back and thought about it with the steady, methodical attention she gave to things that were dense with implication. Neither can live while the other survives, Harry said. That's not the same as Harry Potter must sacrifice himself. No, she said. It's not. It says one of them has to kill the other, Neville said slowly. It doesn't say how. It doesn't say Harry has to die in the process. It also says he has a power Voldemort doesn't know, Hermione said. Which, given what we've seen in the last 2 weeks, she looked at Harry. The 17 inherited spells. The wandless work. The geometric fire, Harry said. And about 6 other things I've been quietly testing. The compulsions weren't just suppressing my output. They were suppressing my access to the Potter line's accumulated magical inheritance. He paused. It's like having a library locked inside you. It's not learned. It's inherited. Ancestral magical memory, Hermione said. She'd been reading about it since Wednesday. It's extremely rare. There are maybe 4 or 5 documented bloodlines in the world that carry it. The Peverills were one. She looked at him. Harry. The Potters descend from the Peveril line. The Deathly Hallows, Neville said quietly. The Deathly Hallows are probably real, Hermione said, and possibly relevant, and I have 17 pages of notes on this that we don't have time to go through right now. She looked at Harry. The point is, the power Voldemort doesn't know isn't just your emotional capacity for love, which is the interpretation I suspect Dumbledore's been working with. It's your entire inherited magical architecture, which has been locked and suppressed since before you were born. Harry looked at the prophecy text. Then he looked up, and there was a clarity to his face that she'd come to recognize as him having made a decision, the specific settled quality of a choice that wasn't going to be revisited. Dumbledore's check is tomorrow morning, he said. Early, based on the recording pattern. He'll know by mid-morning that everything is gone. He paused. I want to be there when he comes to find me. I want to go to him, not wait for him to come to me. I want to walk into his office tomorrow morning before he has time to build a response. He looked at her. And I want you there. You want a witness, she said. I want you there, he said. Not just as a witness. Because, he seemed to search for how to say this. Because you're the one who found it. This is yours as much as mine. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. We go at 8, she said. Before the check. Before he reads the instruments. We walk in while he still thinks everything is normal, and we show him that it isn't. Perfect, Harry said. They went at 8. The gargoyle guarding the headmaster's office moved aside without being given the password, which Harry simply walked past without stopping as though the possibility that it might not had not occurred to him. Hermione followed. The spiral staircase took them up, and Harry knocked on the heavy wooden door at the top, and a voice said come in with the warmth of someone who was expecting a routine morning. Dumbledore was at his desk. It was a large, cluttered, beautiful room, circular, full of silver instruments and moving portraits and the warm light of many candles. He looked up when they entered with an expression of welcoming surprise that shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the first fraction of a second, as his eyes moved to Harry's face and found something there that he hadn't expected. Harry stood in the doorway and looked at Dumbledore, and Dumbledore looked at Harry. The shift in Dumbledore's expression was subtle enough that anyone who wasn't watching very carefully would have missed it entirely. Hermione was watching very carefully. She saw his eyes move to the silent instrument on the shelf to his right, the one that had gone quiet 3 days ago, and then back to Harry. She saw the calculation happen behind his eyes, rapid and precise, and she saw him arrive at a conclusion and then, deliberately, skillfully, put his expression back into warmth and calm and grandfatherly welcome. Harry, he said. And Miss Granger. What a pleasant surprise. Do sit down. We'll stand, Harry said. Pleasantly. Completely without hostility, which was somehow more powerful than anger would have been. "I wanted to talk to you, Professor." "Of course," Dumbledore said. He folded his hands on the desk. "My door is always open." "I've noticed you've been watching me," Harry said. "Specifically, you've been monitoring my magical signature through a mirror on the second floor of the East Wing, quarterly, since before I came to Hogwarts. Since 1985, based on the recording archive." Silence. Dumbledore held his expression. It was remarkable, really, the control of it, the ability to receive a direct statement that should have been impossible for an 11-year-old to know and to not react, not a flinch, not a widening of the eyes. Just, listening. "I found 29 compulsions in Harry's magical architecture," Hermione said. She kept her voice professional and even, the way she'd practiced it. "All of them anchored to your magical signature. The oldest ones anchored to the Potter bloodline directly, placed before Harry's parents were married." Dumbledore looked at her. He looked at her the way he looked at Harry, with that contained, calculating attention, and she looked back at him steadily and thought, "I am not afraid of you. I have read every book in this school that pertains to what you've done and I have dismantled every piece of it, and I am 11 years old and I am not afraid of you." "That's quite a significant discovery," Dumbledore said. His voice was gentle. Thoughtful. "For first-year students. We're aware of what it is," Harry said. "I also know about the succession directive. The Resolution 12-81. The role you've assigned me, without my knowledge or consent, in your plan for dealing with Voldemort." Dumbledore looked at him. "I know about the soul fragment in my scar," Harry said. "I know what you think needs to happen to remove it. I know the timeline you were working to." He paused. "I want you to know that I know all of it." The room was very quiet. The instruments made their small sounds. A portrait shifted somewhere. "Harry," Dumbledore said, and his voice was different now, not cold, not hostile, but lower, and sincere in a way that was perhaps more alarming than hostility would have been, because it was genuinely felt. "I understand that what you've learned must be, very difficult. Very frightening." "I'm not frightened," Harry said. "And I want you to know that everything I have done has been for your protection. And for the protection of the entire wizarding world." He leaned forward slightly, and his eyes, those extraordinarily blue, extraordinarily perceptive eyes, were full of something real. Conviction. The conviction of someone who has lived with a decision for 11 years and has never once stopped believing it was right. "You are extraordinary, Harry. I saw that before you were born. What I did was done in full awareness of the cost, to you, and I do not minimize that cost, but in the service of something larger than any individual life." "Including mine," Harry said. "Yes," Dumbledore said. Without hesitation. "And including my parents' lives." A beat of silence. "Yes," Dumbledore said. Quieter. "You fed Voldemort the partial prophecy," Harry said. "You knew he'd act on it. You knew my parents were at risk. You could have moved them differently, you could have given them better protection, could have handled the Fidelius differently, could have. I made the best decisions available to me at the time," Dumbledore said, and now there was something in his voice that was very slightly strained, not defensive, but the strain of someone whose conviction is being tested from an angle it hasn't been tested from before. "Every choice in a war involves sacrifice. Your parents understood the risks. They didn't understand the risk you specifically represented," Harry said. "That's not the same thing." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. And then he said something she hadn't expected. "No," he said. "It isn't." He sat back. "You're right about that. They didn't know what I knew. That was a choice I made, and you are entitled to be angry about it." Harry looked at him. "I'm not angry," he said. "I'm clear." Dumbledore held his gaze. "What would you like to happen now, Harry?" he said. The question was genuine, she could hear it. This was not a gambit or a move. He was actually asking. I want you to remove yourself from my life, Harry said. Not from Hogwarts, that's above either of us. But from my life. No more monitoring. No more management. No more shaping and steering and engineering what I am or what I'll do. He paused. I'll deal with Voldemort. The prophecy says one of us has to, and I'm willing to honor that, because it's real and it matters and the magical world deserves to be safe. But I'll do it on my terms. In my own time. With the knowledge and the power that is actually mine. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the windows behind him, catching the silver instruments, and he looked, in that light, very old in a way he usually managed to obscure. And if I say no, he said. Quietly. Then I go to the Wizengamot, Harry said. With 43 mirror recordings, 1 succession directive, 29 documented compulsions, diagnosed and removed by a qualified practitioner, he glanced at Hermione. Who has impeccable notes. And testimony from at least one other minor who was also subjected to unauthorized compulsion work traceable to your magical signature. Dumbledore looked at Hermione. Then back at Harry. Then, very slowly, at the silent instrument on his shelf. You've been thorough, he said. We've been thorough, Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. She watched the intelligence behind his eyes moving, building responses, testing them, finding their flaws, discarding them, trying new configurations. She watched the process with profound respect even as she understood that every configuration was aimed at regaining some version of control. It was remarkable to watch someone this good working this hard. And coming up short. If I agree to step back, Dumbledore said finally, you understand that doesn't eliminate the threat. Voldemort is not your lever to use on me, Harry said calmly. I know he exists. I know what the prophecy says. I know what's in my scar. I will handle it. He met Dumbledore's eyes. I want your word. Your magical word, not just your spoken one. Silence. Dumbledore looked at Harry Potter, at this boy, this 11-year-old boy who had sat in his chair and dismantled 11 years of careful architecture with the methodical thoroughness of someone twice his age, and something crossed his face that she would think about for a very long time afterward. It wasn't defeat, exactly. It wasn't grief exactly either. It was something she could only describe as reckoning. The expression of someone who has spent their whole life being the smartest person in every room, and has just found the room where they weren't. Before I give any word, he said, I want to understand something. He looked at Harry with an intensity that stripped away the grandfatherly framing entirely. The wandless work. The ancestral access. How much? Enough, Harry said. Dumbledore's mouth twitched. Once. The ghost of something that might, in a different version of this conversation, have been a smile of actual pleasure. Yes, he said, very quietly. I imagine so. He looked at the window. At the grounds. At something beyond them that neither of them could see. I have been, so certain, he said, more to himself than to either of them, for so very long. Certainty is a luxury that costs other people. He paused. I don't know that I agree with what you're planning, Harry. I want to be clear about that. I think you're taking risks that you don't, with respect, Harry said, they're mine to take. Dumbledore looked at him. Yes, he said. They are. He lifted his wand, she tensed, couldn't help it, and spoke a magical oath, a true one, with the specific resonance of an oath that had real binding force rather than social convention. He named Harry. He named the compulsions and named what they were. He swore to place no further unauthorized enchantments on Harry's person or property. He swore to make no further use of the monitoring mirror. He swore, and this was the one she hadn't expected him to include but he did, without prompting, to provide Harry access, through an agreed channel, to all materials in Hogwarts' restricted archive relevant to the prophecy and the soul fragment. When he finished, the oath light faded. They stood in the morning light, the three of them, and the room hummed with its instruments. "One more thing," Harry said. "Neville Longbottom." Dumbledore looked at him. 8 compulsions, Harry said. All behavioral suppressors. We know their origin. Hermione will remove them within the week. You will not interfere with that process and you will not contact Neville's grandmother about it. A beat. Agreed, Dumbledore said. And Frank and Alice Longbottom, Hermione said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out of its own weight. What they found. What they were going to report. What they knew about you, specifically. Dumbledore went very still. There are healers at St. Mungo's, she said carefully, who have had case notes on Frank and Alice Longbottom sealed under ministry authority for 9 years. Authority filed by the office of the Chief Warlock. She kept her voice measured, factual, the voice of someone presenting evidence rather than making accusations. The soul magic they were investigating before they were tortured. The specific enchantment framework they'd uncovered. The Fidelius extension contract, Miss Granger, Dumbledore said. His voice was very quiet. We have the contract, she said. Snape's copy. We know what it was for. Silence. The Longbottom case notes will be unsealed, Dumbledore said. After a very long pause. I'll see to it. Before the end of term, she said. Before the end of term, he confirmed. She looked at him and he looked at her and there was, between them, a specific charged quality, 2 very intelligent people recognizing each other across a large and complicated distance. She thought she saw him think about saying something, some version of well done or remarkable or any of the range of things that older, more powerful people said to younger people they'd underestimated, and she thought, she hoped, that he thought better of it. She didn't want acknowledgement from him. She wanted him to do what he'd promised. Those were not the same thing. They left the way they'd come. Down the spiral staircase, past the gargoyle, into the corridor. Harry walked in silence for a moment. Then he let out a long, slow breath, and she heard in it about 3 weeks of compressed tension releasing. Was that, he started. Don't ask if that went well, she said. It went as well as it could go. That's not the same as well. No, he said. But it's something. It's significant, she said. He's bound now. He can't undo it without consequences. She paused. He'll try to find other angles. He's not done, Harry. This isn't, I know, he said. I know it's not over. He stopped walking, in the middle of the corridor, and turned to face her. I just want, 10 minutes. To have done something that mattered and not immediately start planning the next thing. She looked at him. He was standing in the corridor in the morning light with his glasses slightly crooked and his hair completely disordered and his eyes very green and very clear and very much his own, and she thought, there he is. Here's the person who was always going to be this person, if only someone had let him. 10 minutes, she said. Fine. He smiled. Properly, fully, with everything present. Thank you, he said. For all of it. All of this. You thanked me at the beginning, she said. That was different, he said. That was, gratitude for doing the thing. This is gratitude for you. Specifically. You specifically. He looked at her steadily in that direct way of his. You didn't have to do any of this. You found it and you could have walked away from it 100 times and you didn't. She held his gaze. I know, she said. I chose not to. Why? He said. The same question he'd asked in the library 3 weeks ago. Same reason as before, she said. Plus, she paused. Plus you're my friend. That's also a reason. He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his face did something quiet and warm, the specific expression she'd been cataloging across 3 weeks of sessions and library evenings and early mornings, the expression she didn't have a name for yet but suspected she would one day. Yeah, he said. Yeah, you're mine too. She was going to say something practical, about Neville's removal, about the prophecy text, about the 17 pages of Deathly Hallows notes waiting in her dormitory, and then she didn't, because he was right, and 10 minutes was a reasonable request, and they had time. They walked back down the corridor together and the castle was waking up around them, breakfast smells drifting up from the kitchens, the portrait subjects stirring, Peeves somewhere in the east wing causing a distant and largely irrelevant commotion, and the morning was ordinary and good in the way that ordinary mornings were good when you just done something extraordinary. In the headmaster's tower, Dumbledore sat for a very long time after they'd gone. He sat in the morning light with his hands folded and the instruments humming and the portraits of his predecessors watching him with the particular attention of the long dead who have seen many versions of this. He was thinking. Not planning, not yet, not quite. Just thinking. About the shape of what he'd built and the shape of what had dismantled it. About an 11-year-old girl who had cast a fourth-year diagnostic charm in a potions classroom and followed its implications with a rigor that put most trained aurors to shame. About an 11-year-old boy who had looked across a desk at him and been, for the first time in 11 years, entirely and completely himself. About what entirely and completely himself meant, at that level of power, at that level of intelligence, without any of the careful management Dumbledore had spent a decade building. He thought, I may have miscalculated. And then he thought, or perhaps not. Perhaps this is better than what I planned. Perhaps he can do it in a way I hadn't accounted for. He reached out and touched the silent instrument on his shelf. It was cold. Empty. Finished. He sat back. All right, he said, to the room, to the portraits, to himself, to the 11 years of patient engineering that had just turned into something he hadn't designed. All right, he said again, more quietly. And picked up his quill. And began, very carefully, to write something new. Chapter 6, who he is now 3 weeks after the meeting in the headmaster's office, the Longbottom case notes were unsealed. Hermione found out from Neville, who found out from his grandmother, who had received a ministry owl on a Thursday morning and had sat at the breakfast table for a very long time afterward without speaking, which Augusta Longbottom apparently never did. She was a woman who filled silences as a point of principle. The silence had lasted 23 minutes. Neville had timed it. He told them in the library that evening, sitting across from Hermione with his hands flat on the table and Trevor nowhere in evidence, which she'd started to notice meant he was being serious. She called me in afterward, he said. She wanted to know if I knew anything about why the notes had been unsealed. Whether I'd heard anything. What did you tell her? Harry said. I told her I'd been doing some research, Neville said. Which is true. He paused. She looked at me for a very long time. And then she said, Neville, there are things I've suspected for years that I chose not to pursue because pursuing them felt too large and too dangerous and I didn't know if I was strong enough. And then she said, he stopped. His voice was steady but it had the particular quality of something being carefully held. Your parents were stronger than I gave them credit for. I think perhaps you are too. Silence. That's everything. Harry said. She hugged me, Neville said. She doesn't usually hug me. Harry looked at him. Good, he said. Simple and direct, with the warmth that was simply how Harry talked now, not performed, not managed, just real. That's good, Neville. Neville nodded. He looked at the table for a moment and then looked up and there was something different about him even from 2 weeks ago, when Hermione had done his removal, a 4-hour session that had been technically simpler than Harry's but emotionally the most draining thing she'd done yet, because Neville's compulsions had been specifically designed to make him believe his own failures, and watching someone disbelieve that with the visceral, full-body surprise of someone who had just been told a lie. They'd been told all their life, that had cost her something she hadn't expected to spend. He was different now. Still Neville, still gentle, still the person who remembered to say thank you and remembered people's birthdays and was kind to things that didn't ask for kindness, but present in his own skin in a way he hadn't been before. His magic had reorganized itself in the 2 weeks since the removal with a thoroughness that frankly astonished her. He'd produced a full corporeal Patronus in their third defense practice session, which was Newt-level work, and had looked at it, a large, steady bear, with an expression of pure uncomplicated joy that she'd found briefly overwhelming to look at directly. His grandmother, apparently, had not asked about that yet. She would. The 3 weeks since the headmaster's office had been, in some ways, the strangest of Hermione's life. Strange in the specific way of the aftermath of something enormous, not the dramatic, high-stakes strangeness of the thing itself but the quieter, more disorienting strangeness of the world continuing on its ordinary axis while you carried something large and permanent and changed inside you. Classes continued. Homework happened. Ron remained blissfully and almost admirably unaware of the fact that the people he ate breakfast with every morning had spent the last month dismantling an 11-year manipulation framework and confronting the most powerful wizard in Britain. He had won 3 consecutive chess tournaments and was deeply satisfied with himself about this, and she found she was completely unable to begrudge him any of it. Snape had returned to his usual precise hostility in the classroom. She'd noticed, though, that he no longer called on Harry to interrogate him, and that his comments on Harry's essays, which were now, freed from their cognitive suppressors, extraordinarily good, were returned with the same terse precision he applied to everyone else. No favoritism. No acknowledgement. Just fairness, which from Snape was itself a statement. Harry had noticed too. He'd said nothing about it, but she'd caught him looking at Snape once with an expression she could only describe as a kind of complicated, careful respect, the respect you gave someone who was genuinely difficult to know and who had helped you anyway. She'd been working through the 17 pages of Peveril lineage notes. They'd expanded to 42 pages. The Deathly Hallows were real. She was now fairly certain of this not as mythology but as magical fact, and the implications were cascading in her notebooks in the specific dense, urgent way that cascading implications always occupied her notebooks, the margins filling up, the original text increasingly buried under annotations, the whole thing starting to require a secondary notebook for overflow. The Elder Wand was in Dumbledore's possession. She was certain of that. The Resurrection Stone she couldn't locate. The Cloak of Invisibility she was 90% certain had belonged to Harry's father and was currently, somewhere. The Dursleys, probably. In a box. She'd mentioned this to Harry last week. He'd said, "The Dursleys have a box of my parents' things in the attic. I saw it once. Aunt Petunia nearly hit me when I asked about it." She'd looked at him for a moment and then said, "We're getting that box." "Over summer," he said. Over summer, she'd agreed. The soul fragment in his scar was the thing she kept returning to, worrying at in the way she worried at problems that didn't have clean solutions yet. Snape's private library had provided 3 useful texts on the theoretical framework of soul fragmentation, all of which described the process of Horcrux creation with an academic detachment she found slightly alarming, and one of which, a very old, very illegal text by a Scottish witch named Morven Macaulay, writing in 1687, described in theoretical terms the conditions under which a soul fragment could be extracted non-fatally from a living host. The conditions were specific. They required the host to have a stronger magical core than the fragment, which Harry did, overwhelmingly, now that his core was fully unblocked. They required a ritual that Macaulay called the severance, which she'd been reconstructing from the fragmentary description over the past 2 weeks. And they required, critically, the willing participation of the fragment's original host. Voldemort, in other words. She'd sat with this problem for 3 days before writing this as a long-term project in her notebook and moving it to a separate section labeled Later. Later was fine. Later was acceptable. Later meant Harry had time, and time was the thing that Dumbledore's plan had never given him. The Friday of the 4th week, Harry didn't come to dinner. She noticed it at the 20-minute mark, the specific absence of someone whose presence she'd calibrated to, and found him after, by the simple method of going to the places he'd taken to going when he needed to be alone. He wasn't in the practice room. He wasn't in the library's back section. He wasn't on the astronomy tower, which she checked on principle. He was on the roof of the Olary. This required either flight or some creative interpretation of the building's exterior stonework, and she was not entirely surprised to find he'd managed it without a broom. He was sitting with his back against the chimney stack and his knees drawn up, watching the sun go down behind the mountains, and Hedwig was on the parapet beside him doing the particular thing she did when Harry was being quiet, not demanding attention, just present, occasionally touching her beak to his shoulder in a small repeated gesture that was purely her. Hermione climbed through the upper window of the Olary, which was less elegant than whatever he'd done but functional, and sat down next to him. The stone was cold. The view was extraordinary. The lake was copper in the evening light and the mountains were going purple and the sky was doing something complex and beautiful that she made a mental note to look at properly and then promptly forgot to look at because Harry was there and he was clearly thinking about something large. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. They sat for a moment. Hedwig regarded her with the amber judgment of an owl who had decided she was acceptable company and moved her attention back to the mountains. "I've been thinking about my parents," he said. She waited. Not the grief stuff," he said. I think I've been through most of the grief stuff. Or at least I've been through the version that was compressed and redirected for 11 years and then came out all at once." He paused. "I mean the people they were. Specifically." He looked at the mountains. "I've been finding things out. In Snape's books, there are references, old order records, notes from the war. My mother was a charms researcher. She was developing entirely new enchantment frameworks when she died. She was, apparently quite brilliantly angry about the state of magical research. She thought the entire field was too conservative and too slow and she was going to change it." He paused. "She sounded, honestly, a bit like you." Hermione smiled at the mountains. "My father was a defensive magic specialist," Harry continued. "He and Sirius Black, who's in Azkaban for something I'm not sure he did anymore, they developed 4 original shield modifications together in the last 2 years of the war. And my father was, apparently very funny, genuinely funny, not just class clown funny. Snape hates him, but even in Snape's notes there are these moments where you can see he's remembering something James Potter did and finding it funny against his will." He paused. "I like knowing that. That he was funny." "You're funny," she said. "I know," he said, without conceit. "I think it's from him." He was quiet for a moment. "The thing I keep coming back to is, they were real people. Full people. They weren't just the parents who died for me. They had work they cared about and friends they loved and plans they were making for after the war. They were going to," he stopped. "There's a letter. In Snape's archive. From my mother to my father, written a week before Godric's Hollow. She talks about what they're going to do when it's over. Where they want to live. She talks about me, about what I was like at 1, what I'd started doing, the words I'd started saying." He paused. "She says I laughed at everything. Apparently I thought everything was funny. The sun was nearly at the mountain line. She says," his voice was steady but she could hear the weight under it, not the compressed redirected weight of the early sessions but the clean, true weight of real grief, which was different because it was real. "She says she can't wait to find out who I'm going to be." Hermione looked at him. "That's what I've been thinking about," he said. "Who I'm going to be. She never got to find out. And for the first 10.5 years of my life, Dumbledore was making sure she'd never be able to find out even posthumously, because the person I was going to be was his design, not mine." He looked at her directly. "And now it's not. Now I actually get to be, whatever I actually am." "What are you actually?" she said. He thought about it. Genuinely considered it, the way he considered things now, fully, without shortcuts. "I'm angry about things that deserve anger," he said. "More than I was raised to be. I think things are wrong when they're wrong, and I don't talk myself out of it. I think about problems until I find the actual shape of them, not just the surface." He paused. "I care about people, not because I'm supposed to, not because it was compulsed into me, but because I actually do. I find people genuinely interesting. Another pause. I can make 17 kinds of fire with my hands. 23 now, she said. I've been counting. The corner of his mouth pulled up. 23 kinds of fire with my hands, he said. And I'm going to learn to use them properly. All of it, the inherited archive, the wandless work, the ancestral magic. I'm going to learn it properly and I'm going to understand it and then I'm going to deal with Voldemort on my own terms, and it's going to be, he looked for the word. Decisive. Yes, she said. Not a martyrdom. Definitely not. Not someone else's planned sacrifice. No. He looked at the sky. The first stars were appearing, faint and distant, punching through the fading light one by one. She'd have liked you, he said. My mom. She'd have liked you a lot. He glanced at her. She'd have found you slightly terrifying, I think, but in the way that she found things that were better than her at something slightly terrifying. Which according to the Order records was how she found everything interesting. Hermione looked at the stars and felt, not uncomfortable, exactly, but moved in a way that she didn't entirely know how to process. She was not accustomed to being seen, not really. She was accustomed to being known for what she could do, which was different. My mum would like you too, she said. She'd ask you about 400 questions and then attempt to feed you, which is what she does with everyone she approves of. I'll eat it, he said immediately. Whatever it is. I will eat all of it. I grew up at the Dursleys. She laughed. Really laughed, sudden and genuine, and he grinned at her, the full grin, the real one, and Hedwig made a small irritated sound at being jostled and resettled her feathers with the dignity of someone who had been briefly discommoded. The laughter faded into the easy quiet of people who were comfortable with each other's silences. What are we going to do about the Philosopher's Stone? Hermione said. Harry turned to look at her. You know about the stone. It's in the school, she said. Fluffy, the three-headed dog on the third floor, is guarding a trapdoor. The stone is under it. Dumbledore brought it here from Gringotts in July. He stared at her. How long have you known this? Since our second week, she said. I put it aside because we had more immediate concerns. Of course you did, he said. He turned back to the mountains. And Quirrell. You know about Quirrell, she said. Since the second day, he said. The turban. The way he smells. The specific quality of the magical resonance off his back, there's something there that isn't him. I've been watching it. Voldemort, she said. Voldemort, he confirmed. On the back of his head, I think. Parasitic inhabitation. It's unpleasant to be near but not immediately dangerous unless someone tries to get to the stone. He paused. Which someone will try. Quirrell's been planning something since Halloween, his classroom magic has been getting more erratic, his behavior more extreme. He's going to move soon. She nodded. She'd reached the same conclusion. We need to get there first, she said. Or be there when it happens, Harry said. On our terms, not his. He looked at her sideways. You've already mapped the traps, haven't you? Devil's Snare, flying keys, chess, a troll which will probably be knocked out already, a logic puzzle with potions, and then the Mirror of Erist, she said. The stone appears in the mirror for someone who wants to find it but not use it. Which means the only person who can retrieve it is someone whose genuine intention is to prevent its use. Which is us, Harry said. Which is us, she confirmed. When? When Quirrell moves. She paused. I think within the week. His pattern's been accelerating. She looked at Harry. And I want to be clear that when we go down there, I want Neville and Luna available. Not necessarily with us in the passage, but in position. If something goes wrong above, nothing will go wrong above, Harry said. Not arrogantly, with the specific confidence of someone who had looked at the available variables and made an accurate assessment. But yes. Luna and Neville on standby. Good thinking. I always have good thinking. You really do, he said. Simply. Factually. She thought about something. Harry. The soul fragment. After Quirrell, after the stone is dealt with and Voldemort is set back again, we start on the severance research, he said. Properly. Over summer. Your house. She blinked. My house? You mentioned your parents' house has a good study, he said. And they won't mind, will they? Me coming for a bit? I'm not. I obviously can't go back to the Dursleys for the whole summer. Dumbledore's oath covers the compulsions but it doesn't cover the rest of it, and I need to, he stopped. I need to have somewhere to be that isn't, yes, she said. Before he finished the sentence. Yes, obviously. My parents will be delighted. She paused. My mum will try to feed you enormous amounts. Perfect, he said. I will eat all of it. She looked at him in the last of the evening light. This boy she'd met on a train 6 weeks ago, who had shaken her hand with the politeness of someone who'd been taught very carefully to be polite and not taught enough about anything else, who had been quiet and humble and slightly dim around the edges. This boy who she'd seen, one careful layer at a time, become this. Who had sat across from Dumbledore without flinching, who had looked at a prophecy that said he was supposed to die and had said no thank you, who made fire with his hands and had his mother's laugh and his father's sharpness and something that was completely and only his own that she still didn't have a name for. This boy who was, of all the people she'd ever met in 11 years of being Hermione Granger, the first person who had ever made her feel that being exactly herself was not a problem to be managed but a thing to be valued. We should go in, she said. It's cold. One more minute, he said. She stayed. The stars were properly out now, scattered across the dark in their ancient patterns, the lake below them going from copper to black, the mountain silhouettes against a sky that was the specific deep blue of very early dark. The castle behind them hummed with 600 people living their ordinary lives, eating and arguing and doing homework badly and finding things to laugh at, and the whole of it was, she looked at it and thought, this is the world. This is what there is. And it's worth the trouble. I've been writing to Sirius Black, Harry said. She turned sharply. Harry, through the network Snape gave me, he said. Not directly. Through a contact at Azkaban who is not entirely uncorruptible if you offer the right things, and who has been passing sealed letters. He looked at her. He's innocent, Hermione. I'm certain of it. The evidence the ministry used to convict him, there's no record of a trial. He was sent to Azkaban without a trial. Dumbledore arranged it. She stared at him. The real secret keeper wasn't Sirius, he said. It was Peter Pettigrew. Who is currently listed as dead and who has been, I think, hiding as Ron's rat for the past 12 years. He paused. Ron's rat has one too many toes on his front left paw and will not go near any cats or owls and reacts very specifically to the word Azkaban. She thought about Crookshank's intense and inexplicable hatred of Scabbers every time she'd brought the cat near the Gryffindor common room. She thought about 12 things she'd noticed about the rat and filed as irrelevant and now recognized as extremely relevant. Right, she said. Right. She took a breath. That's another summer project. There are a lot of summer projects, he said. There are, she agreed. We are going to need a very organized system. You'll build one. Obviously. She paused. Sirius Black. What's he like? In the letters? Harry was quiet for a moment. Angry, he said. Very angry, which is fair. 12 years in Azkaban for something he didn't do will produce anger. He paused. But under the anger, he seemed to be searching for it. Under the anger he's funny. He makes jokes in the middle of describing terrible things. He asks about me, about what I'm like, what I'm interested in. He knew my parents and he wants to." He stopped. "He says I laughed the same way my mum did." Hermione looked at him. She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would add to that. "He says," Harry continued, more quietly, "that when James and Lily found out they were going to have a baby, Sirius was the first person they told. And he says James was terrified. More terrified about being a father than he'd been about anything in the war. And that Lily said to him, 'James, stop being an idiot, you're going to be extraordinary.' And he was." He paused. "According to Sirius. The stars moved in their slow, eternal way. Hedwig spread her wings once, testing the air, and folded them again." "You're going to free him," Hermione said. "Yes," Harry said. "Simply. The Pettigrew evidence, I'm working on it," Harry said. "Snape has access to the original Azkaban commitment records. There's no trial transcript because there wasn't one. It's actually not that complicated to prove, once you have access to the Ministry archive and someone willing to look at it who isn't Dumbledore's person." "Amelia Bones," she said. "Head of Magical Law Enforcement. She's known for being incorruptible and for hating procedural violations," Harry said. "Yes. That's the one." He looked at her. "I was going to suggest her." "I know you were," she said. "I was just saying it first." He laughed. Short and genuine. She stood, brushing cold off her robes, and looked at him still sitting against the chimney stack with Hedwig regarding the night with proprietary satisfaction. "Come on," she said. "Neville's probably done his essay by now and he'll want to review yours." "Mine's better than his," Harry said, standing. "Both of yours are better than everyone else's," she said. "Come on." He climbed through the window after her, back into the warm straw-smelling dark of the Ollery, and they navigated the owl's dignified chaos and came out into the corridor, and the castle received them back into its ordinary warmth. Walking back toward Gryffindor Tower, Harry said, "Hermione." "Yes." "Thank you," he said. "I know I've said it. I'm saying it again. Not for the ritual, I said that. For the past 6 weeks in general. For deciding I was worth the trouble." She looked at him. "You're not trouble," she said. "You're interesting. Those are different things." He smiled. "I'll take it." "You should," she said. "It's a higher compliment." They walked in silence up the staircase, past the sleeping portraits, through the trick step they both now simply stepped over automatically, and arrived at the portrait hole. "The stone," Harry said. "I think Quirrell moves Tuesday." "I think so too," she said. "Monday we do final preparation. Neville and Luna briefed and in position. We go down Tuesday evening." "And after that," he said. "After the stone and Quirrell and whatever Voldemort's current iteration does when his plan doesn't work, summer," she said. "Studies. Sirius. The severance ritual. The cloak. The stone research, not the philosopher's stone, the other stone." She paused. "You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," he said. "The resurrection stone. For the ritual. To potentially allow a controlled contact with the soul fragment's original host." "Yes." She paused. "It's a very long project, Harry. The severance. Even with everything we've got, the Macaulay text, Snape's archive, your ancestral library, it's going to take time. Years, possibly." "That's fine," he said. "I have time now." He said it with the simple, absolute confidence of someone who has recently discovered that they are not, in fact, on a deadline. "I have all the time I need." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "You do." The portrait hole swung open. The common room was warm and bright and full of the comfortable noise of 60 people being alive together, Ron arguing about something with Fred and George, Neville at the table with his essay and his large calm handwriting, Luna on the windowsill reading her Quibbler upside down with her feet tucked under her, looking entirely as though she'd been there all evening, which perhaps she had. Harry walked in and the room received him, and nobody in it knew, nobody except the four of them who did, that anything had changed. He looked the same. Messy hair, too big jumper, glasses slightly crooked. The boy who'd arrived 6 weeks ago. Except that he wasn't, not remotely, not in any way that could be undone or managed or redirected. He was Harry Potter, and he knew exactly who that was, and he was going to decide, entirely on his own terms, what it meant. He crossed the room and dropped into the chair across from Neville and said, "How's the essay?" "Better than last week," Neville said. "Worse than yours, probably." "Show me," Harry said. "I'll tell you what to fix." Neville pushed it across. Harry read it, quickly and completely, and started talking, not talking down, not the way a better student condescended, but the way someone who understood something explained it to someone who nearly did, finding the gap and filling it directly, and Neville listened and nodded and asked one sharp question, and Harry answered it. Hermione sat down with her own books. Luna drifted over from the windowsill and settled into the adjacent chair with the Quibbler and a slightly prophetic expression and said, to no one in particular, "I think Tuesday will be interesting." "Tuesday will be fine," Harry said, not looking up from Neville's essay. "More than fine, I think," Luna said. "Something will begin on Tuesday." "Several things have already begun," Harry said. "Yes," Luna said. "But Tuesday will be the visible part." He looked up at her and she looked at him with those large, clear, seeing eyes, and he smiled at her, the real one, the complete one, and said, "Good." Outside, the castle stood in its grounds against the Scottish dark, the lake black and still, the mountains patient and permanent as they had always been. Inside, the fire burned and the students bent over their work and the portraits slept in their frames and the instruments in the headmaster's tower hummed their quiet data into the night. In his office, Dumbledore sat with a new kind of parchment and a new kind of plan, one he hadn't written, one that had been handed to him fully formed by an 11-year-old boy and the girl who had pulled back the curtain. He was rewriting it, not in defiance of them but around them, the old instinct, the deep-set habit of arrangement and control, and then he stopped. He looked at what he'd written. He put the quill down. He thought about a woman who had made entirely new enchantment frameworks. He thought about a man who was funny against all odds in the middle of a war. He thought about what they'd made together, what they'd been making in the year before Godric's Hollow, not just the baby with the scar but the architecture of a life that would never get to be lived. He thought about what that boy was going to do now, with all of himself available to him and none of Dumbledore's architecture left standing. He picked up the quill. He crossed out everything he'd written. He sat for a long time with the blank parchment, and the blank was not comfortable but it was honest, and honesty was something he had been letting himself run short on for a very long time. Then he wrote, in his careful old hand, "Let him choose." 3 words. He looked at them. Then he stood, and went to the window, and looked out at the grounds, and at the castle, and at the light in the Gryffindor Tower windows, and at the dark water of the lake beyond, and at the mountains beyond that, patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to the plans of men, however old or powerful or certain those men had been. The stars were out. Somewhere in the castle, someone laughed, clear and sudden and genuine, and the sound carried up through the old stones and out into the cold air and across the grounds, and it was the laugh of someone who had remembered, at last, that they were allowed to. Dumbledore listened to it. His expression, in the window's dark reflection, was not the expression of defeat. It was something more complicated and more honest than defeat. It was the expression of a man who had lived 110 years and had just, finally, learned something new. "All right, Lily," he said softly. "To the window. To the stars. To the memory of a woman who had said, 'Stop being an idiot, you're going to be extraordinary.' All right." He turned from the window and went back to his desk and the blank parchment, and began, carefully, and without any certainty about how it would end, to write something that was not a plan so much as a permission. And in Gryffindor Tower, the fire burned, and 4 unlikely friends worked and argued and laughed, and Harry Potter, all of him, finally, completely, without filter or management or deliberate diminishment, sat in the warm ordinary light and was, for the first time in his life, entirely himself. It was, as Luna had suggested, enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was, it turned out, everything.